One November night in 2004, in a tiny town in Alaska, a state trooper was responding to a call about a potential car accident. The trooper eventually reached the isolated logging road where this accident supposedly happened, and sure enough, he saw a smoking vehicle that had clearly gone off the road. The trooper quickly got out of his vehicle and rushed down the embankment to the crashed car to see if there was anyone inside that he could help. But when the trooper looked inside the car, at first he was just confused. Then he happened to look into the back seat of the car, and immediately he recoiled in horror. This was no car accident. This was something else. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to wash the Amazon Music follow button's laundry, but instead of using laundry detergent, just use black computer ink. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of Saturday, November 13th, 2004, in a tiny city called Correggio, Alaska, all the people who were attending the Chamber of Commerce banquet suddenly stood up and broke into applause for 48-year-old Lori Waterman. Lori was sitting at a table in the back of the room. She was tall with short brown hair and her skin was very pale, but at this moment, her cheeks were flushed red with embarrassment as she looked around at all the familiar faces smiling at her. Lori knew almost all of the 1,300 residents in Correggio, Alaska from her many years as a community volunteer and special education teacher's aide. And Lori definitely knew everyone at this banquet because she had helped her friend organize it. From the podium, Lori's friend told the room that she couldn't have put on this event without Lori, and that Lori was really the one person in Correggio, Alaska that people could always count on if they needed help with anything. Lori stood up and smiled sheepishly and waved to all the people in the room as they continued to cheer for her. Lori wished her husband, Doc Waterman, had been there to see this, but unfortunately, he was hundreds of miles away in Juneau, Alaska, on a business trip for the weekend. Lori's husband was a prominent real estate agent. Still, Lori had the feeling that this was her lucky night. She had won the raffle for a fleece jacket earlier in the evening, and by the time the dinner wrapped up at about 10 p.m., so many people had thanked her personally for all her help through the years that she truly felt appreciated and celebrated. At the conclusion of the banquet, Lori hugged her friend who she had planned this banquet with, and then said she would see her again the next day after church. Both Lori and her friend were on a committee that helped raise money for an international Catholic event for young people. The friends hugged one more time, said goodbye, and then Lori turned around and headed for the parking lot. Lori drove her purple minivan to her peach-colored house at 604 Ocean View Drive. With its spectacular view of the bay, the 3-bedroom, 3-bath house was one of the nicest in town. But to Lori, the house always felt a bit empty whenever Doc was away. And also this night, Lori and Doc's 16-year-old daughter, Rochelle, was also out of town at a volleyball tournament in Anchorage. So tonight, Lori was going to be all alone. As Lori headed upstairs for the night, she walked past Rochelle's bedroom and thought about the fight they had had right before Rochelle left town with her volleyball team. Lori had seen the all-black outfits that her daughter was packing for this trip and asked Rochelle why she couldn't bring something a bit more cheery. Lori was not a big fan of the goth stylings that Rochelle had adopted over the last year, but Lori's daughter just rolled her eyes at her mother as soon as she began talking about her outfit. Then Lori also told her daughter that she didn't really like the shaggy 20-something-year-old guys that Rochelle had been hanging out with recently. They seemed polite, but Lori felt like they were just too old for Rochelle, and they also didn't seem ambitious enough for an honor roll student like Lori's daughter. One of them even lived in his mother's basement. Rochelle had cursed at her mother when Lori had said some things about her friends, and at that point, Lori was furious and she just couldn't contain herself. Lori began complaining about all the time Rochelle spent on her computer, specifically all the time that Rochelle spent publicly embarrassing her family on the computer. Rochelle was a blogger whose blog, called My Crappy Life, often harshly criticized the people in her life and referred to their town not as Craig, Alaska, but as Hell, Alaska. This online journal really upset Lori because she wanted to give her daughter the best life possible. But the blog's title, My Crappy Life, really made Lori feel like she had failed as a mother. But perhaps what bothered Lori most about the blog was that Rochelle had made their mother-daughter friction public. Once, Rochelle had written about coming home from school and proudly telling her mother that she had scored a 92 on a Spanish test, but she had said her mom, Lori, ignored her grade completely and just told her she should go to fat camp. But that wasn't even true. Lori had told her daughter that maybe she should eat healthier, but never once mentioned fat camp. This fight they got into had ended with Rochelle theatrically throwing even more black clothing into her suitcase and Lori storming out of her room. Now, thinking back over what happened, Lori regretted the things she said and how blunt she had been. She still disliked the gloomy clothes, the two old friends, and the rude-seeming blog, but she really wished she had not offended her daughter. So, while Rochelle was off at her volleyball tournament, Lori had written her a letter, expressing how sorry she was that they had been arguing lately. Lori said that she hoped they could get back to the way things used to be when they were closer. Lori had left this note on Rochelle's nightstand, knowing she would find it when she came home, and Lori hoped it would help reset their relationship. Lori walked down the hall into her and Doc's bedroom and changed into her nightgown. She brushed her teeth and got ready for bed. As she took off her wedding band and engagement ring, she thought about Doc, wishing her husband did not have to travel so much for work. Doc was a dozen years older than Lori and not far from retirement age. Lori had hoped that he'd start throttling down his workload, but lately it seemed that Doc had been busier than ever. But Lori couldn't help but wonder if maybe there was another reason why Doc was staying away so much. She knew her husband had a wandering eye. People had made innuendos to her about that before. Lori tried not to listen to the gossip. She knew Doc could be a flirt, but she was sure he would never actually cheat on her. Still, on this night, when Lori was already feeling insecure about her relationship with her daughter, the rumors about her husband's supposed affair really nagged at her. Lori slipped into bed around 11 p.m. She grabbed the TV remote from the bedside table and turned on the TV. She didn't mind a little solitude, but she had been on her own for a few days now, and she couldn't wait for her husband and daughter to come home the next day. After a few minutes of TV channel surfing, Lori turned out the lights and drifted off to sleep. At 3:30 p.m. the next day, which was a Sunday, Doc Waterman and his daughter Rochelle drove towards their house. They had been in different cities over the weekend, but their paths had crossed at the airport, and so they headed home together. Like Lori, Doc was a highly respected figure in town. The Vietnam War veteran had his struggles, including the lingering effects of post-traumatic stress, but he'd managed to build a family and a career as the top real estate agent on the whole Prince of Wales Island, which is where Craig, Alaska was, which is one of the biggest islands in the entire United States. Doc steered his car down Ocean View and turned into his driveway. He then opened the garage door to park, and immediately he noticed that his wife's purple minivan was gone. Doc had expected Lori to be home to greet them, but then again, she was always busy, even on a Sunday. Doc figured she must be out running an errand or attending a meeting. And at this point, Doc was actually far more concerned about his daughter, Rochelle, who had sprained her ankle during her volleyball tournament. And so Doc helped his daughter limp into the house and upstairs. Rochelle hobbled into her room and sat down on her bed. She looked over at her nightstand and she saw the letter her mother had written her. She unfolded it, and as she started to read, she began to cry. She hated how much she and her mom had been fighting, and she too wished things were different. Eventually, Rochelle wiped the tears away and put the letter down. Meanwhile, Doc walked into the kitchen to check the messages on the answering machine. He noticed an empty bottle of wine sitting on the counter, which he found very odd, because Lori really was not a drinker and certainly would not be drinking on her own. The answering machine showed 3 messages. Doc pressed play and listened, but all the calls were from him checking in as he made his way home. Doc carried his suitcase up to his and Lori's bedroom on the 3rd floor. Normally, he'd drop his luggage on top of the comforter and start to unpack, but the bed was unmade. Lori always made the bed. That is, if Doc didn't beat her to it. Doc also saw Lori's nightgown thrown haphazardly on the floor. He frowned. His wife of 20 years was a total neat freak. What was going on? Doc suddenly felt flush with concern and stepped into the bathroom to splash water on his face. As he turned on the faucet, he saw Lori's engagement ring and wedding ring sitting next to the sink. Now, Doc was really worried. Lori never went anywhere without those rings. Something very strange was going on. Doc couldn't tell what it was, but he had a sinking feeling that it was bad. Doc knew there were not that many places in their small town where Lori might be, and he couldn't just call her because in 2004, cell phones were still somewhat rare, and Lori didn't have one. So Doc just waited a few hours, hoping Lori would come home on her own, but by 7 p.m., when she hadn't and he hadn't heard from her, Doc felt like he had to act. He didn't want to alarm his daughter, but he told Rochelle that they needed to get in the car and drive around town and look for her mother. Doc and Rochelle drove to the building where the Chamber of Commerce banquet had been held the night before, thinking maybe they'd see Lori's purple minivan parked outside while she helped to clean up inside. But when they got there, her minivan, which anyone could spot a mile away, was nowhere to be found. Next, the father and daughter went to the church, but they didn't see Lori's van there either. Doc did see Lori's friend's car, and he remembered Lori saying she had a committee meeting with her friend that day, but when Doc talked to Lori's friend, the friend said that Lori did not show up to the meeting and had not called to explain why she couldn't be there. So Doc and Rochelle drove to the middle school where Lori worked, but the parking lot was empty. Despite the near-freezing temperatures outside, Doc was sweating. When he and Rochelle had started their search, he was perplexed. Now he was desperate. After driving around for almost 2 hours with no sign of Lori, Doc and Rochelle didn't know what else to do. So at around 9 p.m., they went home, and the normally composed Doc tried to keep from choking up as he called the Craig police. At about the same time Doc was calling the police, Alaska State Trooper Bob Claus drove his SUV down a logging road that cut through a pine-covered mountain nearly 50 miles from Craig. He was one of only 2 troopers who patrolled the entire 145-mile-long island. Claus was out in this area responding to a call he had received from a hunter who had said they had seen a vehicle that had gone off the road and caught on fire. Claus had spotted the plume of smoke in the sky and drove over, and there he found the remains of a minivan on the side of the mountain. It looked like the minivan had careened off the logging road until it struck a fallen log, which prevented it from rolling any further. The van was no longer on fire, but the brush and log beneath it were still smoldering. Claus climbed out of his vehicle and hiked down the slippery wet slope to reach the wreck. When he got there, he saw the tires were melted down to their steel belts. The paint had been scorched off the frame and all the windows were blown out. The fire had burned everything inside the vehicle. Claus looked for something to identify the minivan, but the license plate was a puddle of aluminum, and the vehicle identification number on the driver's side door was melted beyond recognition. Claus had originally come out here believing he was going to find a road accident, that someone had crashed, and that's why this had happened. But when he kind of scanned around the inside of the vehicle, he felt like this was something far worse. If this had been an accidental car crash, Claus would have expected to see the driver's body in the front seat, or at least nearby, and some sign that they had been in the front seat. But the 2 front seats of the car were empty and there was no sign of a driver. But when Claus looked in the back of the car, he saw something absolutely horrible. There, laying across the back seat, were the charred remains of a human torso. And next to the torso, looking straight at Claus, was a blackened human skull. Claus didn't want to move the vehicle or disturb its contents until help arrived, so he radioed his partner and asked him to stay with the minivan while he called his lieutenant in Craig, Alaska. The lieutenant, in turn, called the Alaska Bureau of Investigation to send help. The Bureau promised to send a team, but cautioned that it would take time for help to arrive. Prince of Wales Island is located 800 miles south of Anchorage, and it has no major airports, and so the trip to the island requires 5 different planes. But finally, a day later, The small aircraft carrying state homicide investigator Randy McFerrin, a state fire investigator, and a crime scene technician touched down at a local airstrip. Right away, the investigators drove out to meet the state troopers on that logging road overlooking the crash site, and when they got there, McFerrin peered down at the wreck, while the fire investigator immediately began taking pictures from the seat next to him. McFerrin, a former Army infantry officer, was an experienced investigator who had led 8 homicide investigations by himself. McFerrin got out of the vehicle and shook hands with Trooper Bob Claus. Claus was relieved to see heavy hitters from Anchorage on the scene. Claus had handled all kinds of cases over his career, but this case seemed far more complex than his 2-man station could handle. Claus told McFerrin that they had received a missing person report the night before from the husband of a woman from Craig, a community activist named Lori Waterman. As he said Lori's name, Claus grimaced because he knew Lori really well. His daughter was friendly with her daughter, Rochelle, and like most people in town, Claus liked both Lori and Doc Waterman. It absolutely gutted Claus to think that Lori could be the body in this wreckage, but he would tell the state investigators that that was looking more and more likely. The burned-out vehicle was clearly a minivan, just like the one Lori drove, but the paint had all been scorched off, so it was impossible to tell whether it had once been purple. Claus led McFerrin and the fire investigator down the slope to get a better look at the wreck. The wreck was about 50 yards down the mountain from the gravel road. When they got down to it, McFerrin peered inside at the charred human remains in the back seat. The clothes had burned off completely, and the fire had reduced the lower portion of their legs and the lower portion of the victim's arms to ash, making it truly impossible to tell whether the body was a man or a woman. But right away, the fire investigator could see telltale blistering in the back seat that suggested that an accelerant had caused the fire to burn very hot and fast. In other words, it looked like someone had set this fire on purpose. And adding credibility to that theory, the investigators couldn't find any skid marks on the road, suggesting the driver of this vehicle had never tried to stop, and when people are about to crash, they hit the brakes and they skid, but in this case, there was none of that. McFerrin sighed and looked over at Claus and said, whoever was in this car was murdered. He figured the fire was an attempt to destroy evidence. And whoever had set the fire had very nearly succeeded, because the human remains that crime scene technicians removed from the van weighed just 33 pounds. The rest of that body was just gone. McFerrin ordered the technicians to put all of the human remains into an evidence bag and ship it to Anchorage for an autopsy. Claus arranged for a tow truck to take the wrecked minivan to a nearby garage for further analysis, but as they moved the vehicle, McFerrin found the metal tag from the dashboard that had melted off during the fire, and amazingly, he could still read the minivan's identification number on this tag. And so within minutes, investigators knew exactly who owned this wrecked minivan. Later that night, McFerrin traveled with Claus to the town of Craig to speak with Lori's husband, Doc. Rochelle was home too, along with her friend, Jason Arant. Jason was a large man with flaming red hair, and at 24 years old, he was 8 years older than Rochelle. But the two had become close when Rochelle had worked at a store owned by Jason's best friend the previous summer. Rochelle had called Jason earlier that day because she was worried that something bad had happened to her mother. Rochelle said her mom must have gotten into a drunk driving accident because of the empty wine bottle she and her dad had found in the kitchen. Jason had immediately left his job as a school custodian and gone to Rochelle's school to pick her up. He found her in the principal's office in tears about her missing mother, so Jason had driven her home. McFerrin wanted to speak with the family alone, but Jason said he didn't want to leave Rochelle's side. That is, until Trooper Claus stepped in. Jason had actually come to Claus previously for advice on how to become a Marine, and so he respected the state trooper. So when Claus stepped in and told Jason the family really needed some privacy, Jason listened and he left. Doc invited Claus and McFerrin into the TV room on the first floor of the house. The investigators sat on the couch, but Doc and Rochelle remained standing, bracing themselves for whatever potentially terrible news they were about to learn. After a pause, McFerrin leaned forward, choosing his words very carefully, as he told Doc that they had discovered Lori's burned-out van in the woods 50 miles away, and there was a body in the back seat. McFerrin said that police still needed to make a positive ID of the body, but no one aside from Lori had been reported missing. And so unfortunately, it seemed very likely that the body was Lori. Doc was silent for a moment, and then he sort of stumbled back and fell into a chair. He had seen more than his share of death in Vietnam, and he had never cried, but this was different. He put his face in his hands and he wept. Trooper Claus turned to Rochelle, who he had known since she was a little girl, and told her how very sorry he was. But Rochelle didn't respond. Instead, she ran upstairs to her bedroom and slammed the door. As she sat on her bed, reeling at the news, her eyes fell on Lori's letter. Rochelle couldn't bear to look at it, so she put the letter inside the nightstand drawer. Meanwhile, downstairs, McFerrin had to make a very difficult request. He needed Doc to obtain his wife's dental x-rays to help identify the body. And so Doc had fumbled through Lori's address book, saying nothing until he found the number of Lori's dentist. And so McFerrin made the call and got Lori's latest x-rays sent to the coroner in Anchorage to see if maybe it was a match. After hanging up with the dentist, McFerrin and Claus asked Doc to walk them through his house and show them everything he had found the day before that seemed sort of strange or out of place and contributed to his worry about his wife. And in fact, in the day since Doc had come home, he had found even more alarming evidence of a crime. Doc took the investigators up to his and Lori's bedroom to show them the tip of a rubber glove and also a 5-inch long fiber from a rope he had found in the sheets of their bed. Then Doc pulled back the comforter on his bed to show them a spot of blood on the sheets. He said at first he assumed this might be menstrual blood, but when he had looked closer, he had seen a few other spots on both sides of the bed. Doc told the investigators that he had no idea who would want to harm his wife. Claus agreed that everyone on the island really seemed to love Lori. At this point, McFerrin very gently told Doc to go ahead and leave the house along with his daughter, because now their home was officially a crime scene and it would soon be cordoned off with yellow tape. With the help of the crime scene technician who had flown out from Anchorage with him, McFerrin started the official search of the house, and almost immediately, he figured out how the assailant had gotten inside. The door that led from the garage into the house had scratches on the lock that indicated to McFerrin that the assailant attempted to force their way in. Meanwhile, Claus began searching Rochelle's room. The walls were adorned with posters of men and women with black hair, black clothes, and black makeup. Claus continued searching through Rochelle's room, searching her dresser, her shelves, and her closet, and then inside of her nightstand, he found that letter that Lori had written to Rochelle. Claus saw that Lori addressed it to, quote, "my dearest daughter," end quote, and he felt a twinge of compassion for this mother trying to reconnect with her daughter. Claus made a mental note to make sure to return this letter to the family. When Claus and McFerrin regrouped in the TV room a little while later, they immediately began reviewing what they had found. Other than a few spots of blood on the bed, there was no sign of a struggle. A couple of details suggested to the investigators that Lori was alive when she left the house. The nightgown, uncharacteristically thrown on the floor, indicated she might have changed in a hurry, and the rope fiber inside the bed sheets suggested the attacker might have tied Lori up at the house rather than killed her. Both investigators agreed that the assailant's break-in attempt looked clumsy and amateurish, but the rope and the rubber glove suggested the killer had planned the crime ahead of time. McFerrin noted that a premeditated crime like this was typically not random. It was usually committed by someone with a personal grudge against the victim. But the scratches on the door where the assailant had entered the house suggested they did not know this family well, because Doc told investigators that most people who knew them would know where he kept the spare key and would have simply unlocked the door. This was perplexing to investigators, so until they could narrow it down, everybody was a suspect. Statistically, the most likely person to have murdered Lori was her own husband. So McFerrin started with Doc. Claus had told McFerrin about the rumors that circulated around town that Doc was having an affair. That was a big red flag. A cheating spouse could have all sorts of reasons to want their partner dead. Doc denied having an affair. He knew what people said about him, and he admitted that he could be flirtatious, plus he was away from home a lot. Small-town rumors really didn't need much more fuel than that. But even if he had been having an affair, it didn't matter. He had a rock-solid alibi. He was over 200 miles away in Juneau at the time of the murder. McFerrin made a mental note to look into the family's finances and phone records to see if Doc could have hired someone to kill Lori while he was away, but he suspected that was a total long shot. If Doc had been involved in planning this crime, McFerrin was pretty sure the killer would not have had such a hard time getting into the house in the first place. Surely if Doc had hired someone to murder his wife, he would have told the killer where to find the spare key. The following day, which was Tuesday, November 16th, McFerrin finally heard back from the coroner in Anchorage, and as expected, the body was Lori's. The coroner said the fire that had erupted inside of that minivan had reached 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, the same heat at which bodies are cremated, damaging the remains so badly that a proper autopsy was nearly impossible. But the coroner had been able to match Lori's dental x-rays with the teeth in the skull. However, the coroner was not able to zero in on the time of death or even how Lori had died. McFerrin looked into Doc's bank accounts and found no indication of any money transfers, cash withdrawals, or suspicious gaps in income that could suggest he was trying to hide or transfer funds. And the family's phone records were totally mundane, no unknown numbers or unusual late-night calls. McFerrin eliminated Doc as a primary suspect, and he was eager to talk further with Rochelle, hoping she might shed some light on who might want to hurt her mother. A few hours after the coroner had identified Lori's body, McFerrin picked up Rochelle at her house and drove her to the police station for an official interview. On the short drive, McFerrin tried to make Rochelle feel comfortable, telling her about his own daughter, who was just a few years older than her and in college. Rochelle's eyes were red and puffy, but she seemed to relax and talked about a trip to Germany she and a friend had been planning to take the following year. The pair eventually got to the small police station, and there, McFerrin escorted Rochelle through the small station to a small, windowless interview room. Once they sat down inside, Rochelle said she spoke to her mother just before the Chamber of Commerce dinner on Saturday night. She said her mom seemed excited about the event, and she was looking forward to Rochelle and her father coming home. Rochelle also said that her mom basically got along with everyone. In fact, Rochelle admitted that she, herself, was likely the only person who regularly butted heads with Lori. And even that was nothing major. Most of their arguments were over the way Rochelle dressed or the way she painted her nails black. McFerrin then picked up Lori's letter and read it aloud to Rochelle, and then asked her what could have inspired her mother to write it. Rochelle admitted that her mother did not like some of her friends because they were too old in her mother's eyes, and so they had argued about that. She said her mom especially disliked Jason, her friend who had been at the house when investigators had first visited, but Rochelle said her mom just didn't understand. Rochelle said that her mom was convinced that Rochelle was dating Jason, but Rochelle said she was not. He was just a good friend, nothing more. McFerrin would ask Rochelle several more questions, and he would eventually learn about her blog, which also was a point of contention in Rochelle and Lori's lives. But eventually the interview came to an end, and overall, nothing major really came out of it. However, McFerrin was interested to look more closely at Rochelle's blog. So he drove Rochelle home, and then he and Claus went back to the station, and they sat down at a computer, and they loaded up Rochelle's blog. The blog was pretty harsh. Rochelle complained about her mother a lot, even calling her nasty names like psycho bitch. But both McFerrin and Claus were fathers to girls around Rochelle's age, and they were well aware of the friction that can grow between teenage daughters and their mothers. And so nothing in Rochelle's blog struck either detective as anything more than a typical teenage girl's diary, well, except for the fact that the blog was public. And so they wondered if maybe somebody reading Rochelle's blog had become really fixated with Rochelle's conflicts with her mother. And so the investigators decided to scour Rochelle's electronic communications for any unusual or alarming messages. The next morning at the breakfast table, Claus talked to his daughter, who was good friends with Rochelle, and his daughter said the students were in complete shock that Rochelle's mother had been killed. Murders almost never happened in their tiny town, and certainly not to her friend's parents. But then Claus's daughter told him something interesting. She told him that Rochelle spent a lot of time around 3 people in particular. There was Jason, there was also Jason's friend, Brian Riddell, and there was Rochelle's ex-boyfriend, 16-year-old Ian Lendrum, so 3 guys. And apparently Rochelle and these 3 guys would all play video and fantasy role-playing games together, and Claus's daughter said that sometimes these 3 guys would just show up unannounced when she, Claus's daughter, was trying to hang out with Rochelle alone. Claus's ears pricked up at this. Rochelle had not mentioned that she had an ex-boyfriend. Claus called McFerrin and told him they needed to speak with Ian Lendrum right away. Later that morning, so this was 3.5 days after the murder, McFerrin tracked down Ian at his house. The teenager had just woken up, but McFerrin noted that Ian was not surprised to see him. Ian said that everyone on the island had been talking about Laurie's murder. McFerrin followed Ian into his kitchen and sat at the small round table. Ian poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to McFerrin, and sat down across from him. Ian said that he had seen Rochelle after she and her dad had searched for Laurie around town. Ian said he hadn't known anything about Laurie's disappearance, but he'd gotten worried about Rochelle because she wasn't answering her phone, and so that night he'd just gone over to her house to check on her. But right after saying this, Ian immediately jumped up from the table and rushed over to get sugar for their coffee. And to McFerrin, it seemed like Ian was really nervous. But McFerrin knew that people often got nervous when they were being questioned by the police, even if they didn't do anything. McFerrin thanked Ian for the sugar when he returned, and then McFerrin sipped his coffee and kept his tone casual. He was watching for signs that Ian was hiding something. He asked Ian about his history with Rochelle, and Ian blushed a bit, but then he said that yes, he had dated Rochelle for a while, but they had broken up a year earlier, however, they had remained close friends. McFerrin asked Ian about the 2 older guys, Jason and Brian, who also hung out with him and Rochelle. Ian told McFerrin that he and Rochelle were both very good friends with the other 2 guys. Brian owned the shop where they often played video games, and his buddy Jason often joined in. Ian also admitted to McFerrin that Rochelle's other teenage friends did not really hang out with her when Jason and Brian were around. Ian thought Jason rubbed the girls the wrong way. McFerrin had met Jason briefly. Jason had been with Rochelle when investigators had gone to their house. But now McFerrin really wanted to talk to Jason again to see why this young man might rub the girls the wrong way. At noon the same day, McFerrin met with Jason at the Trooper Post near the high school where Jason worked. McFerrin brought Jason into an interview room and offered him some water. Jason nodded and took the bottle from him, but left it on the table unopened. Jason, a big man nicknamed Red for the color of his hair, had once dreamed of becoming a Marine, but he had washed out of boot camp, mainly because he was seriously out of shape. So Jason came back to the small town of Craig, got a job as a high school janitor, and moved into his mother's basement. He also began hanging out at his buddy Brian's computer shop. As Jason and McFerrin talked, Jason spoke slowly and very carefully. He said he had previously dated Rochelle, something Rochelle never mentioned in her discussion with McFerrin. That was pretty strange, McFerrin thought. But Jason said that their romance did not last long because it caused way too much trouble for Rochelle at home. McFerrin couldn't be sure if Jason was telling the truth about dating Rochelle or if that was just male bluster, but Jason's claim did suggest that he was well aware that Laurie disapproved of him hanging around with her daughter. And McFerrin started to wonder if maybe Jason had wanted to get rid of Laurie because she got in the way of his relationship with Rochelle. McFerrin asked Jason what he was up to on the night of the murder, and he would say that he had been with his friend Brian at his place playing video games. They'd both been drinking, so Jason said he had just crashed there overnight. Eventually, the interview ended, and McFerrin let Jason go home for the day, but McFerrin still had a lot of unanswered questions about this young man. But as it would turn out, McFerrin would not have to wait very long to talk to Jason again. A few hours later, at 5:30 in the afternoon, Trooper Claus was sitting at his desk when his phone rang. Claus answered, and he heard a frantic voice on the other line. It was Jason, and Claus could barely understand what he was saying. Claus told Jason to take a breath and then asked what was going on. Jason shouted into the phone that he was at the school where he worked and he'd just been attacked by a man with a knife. Claus hung up the phone and immediately told McFerrin about the call. The two investigators raced over to the school, and when they arrived, they found Jason sitting on the bleachers by the football field. He was in tears as he told them that a man had snuck up on him by the dumpsters and held a knife to his neck. Jason said the man had warned him to stay away from Rochelle, or there was going to be another accident. Then the man ran the knife across Jason's neck. Jason showed the investigators a red mark that the serrated blade had left on his skin. Claus and McFerrin exchanged looks that expressed their doubts. They had been suspicious of Jason before because of his hidden romance with Rochelle, but his conduct now just seemed bizarre. He had no witness to back up his story, and the wound on his neck looked totally superficial and was likely self-inflicted. So the investigators wondered if this was a misguided attempt to distract them by introducing a new mystery suspect. McFerrin quickly pressed Jason for a description of his attacker. Jason claimed he didn't get a good look at the man, but McFerrin said that seemed highly unlikely. The attack happened in broad daylight. Surely Jason would have seen something that could help them identify the assailant. Jason's voice got softer as he tried to grasp for details. He was fumbling, which meant he was vulnerable. So McFerrin dropped any pretense that he believed what Jason was saying. He told Jason flat out that he thought he was lying. Jason looked like he had just gotten the wind knocked out of him. He was quiet for several seconds, then he let out a deep sigh and admitted that it was true. No one had attacked him. He had cut himself. Now, McFerrin knew he had the advantage. So he narrowed his eyes, stepped a bit closer to Jason to kind of intimidate him, and he told Jason that he thought he was also lying about another story he had told police. The one Jason had told police about what he was doing on the night Lori Waterman was killed. Jason started stuttering and said he really wasn't lying about that, but his face was flushed and he was sweating and talking in circles. The experienced investigators could see Jason's facade was starting to crumble. So McFerrin cut him off and said in a slow and certain tone that he knew Jason took part in Lori's murder. But now Jason's voice changed. He wasn't stuttering anymore. He spoke with urgency, like what he was saying was true and he needed them to believe it. He told the investigators that they really didn't understand. They did not know what Lori had done to deserve what happened to her. She was not this perfect person everyone thought she was. Then the big red-headed man looked right at McFerrin and he said he did not kill Lori, but he knew who did. Based on information provided by Jason and evidence discovered throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Lori Waterman on the evening of Saturday, November 13th, 2004. Not long after midnight, the killer stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. He picked up an electric razor from the counter, flipped it on, and methodically shaved off his bushy brown beard. When his face was clean-shaven, he brought the razor up to his head, and clumps of his floppy brown hair started falling into the sink. He knew from TV crime shows that a few strands of hair could give a killer away, so he wanted to make sure none of his hairs were left behind at the crime scene, hence why he was shaving them all off. A little before 1 a.m., the killer walked into his bedroom and grabbed a trash bag off the floor. Then he threw a bunch of supplies, including a roll of duct tape, a bristly old rope, and a bottle of wine, into that bag. With his break-in kit in hand, he stepped outside and got into his partner's idling pickup truck, and the two of them drove together to Lori's house. When they arrived, the killer picked his trash bag off the floorboard, got out of the truck, and closed the passenger door behind him. His partner sped away down the street. The killer looked at the big peach-colored house in the moonlight and reminded himself why he was doing this. A dangerous woman lived in that house and she needed to be stopped. The killer pulled a pair of latex gloves from the trash bag, slipped them on, and then climbed into the two-car garage through a window. Once inside, he tried the door that led into the house, but it was locked. He tried to jimmy open the door with a butter knife that he'd brought along. He scratched up the striker plate on the lock, but he just couldn't get it to open. So he removed the cat door, crouched down, reached through the opening, stretched his arm out to unlock the door from the other side, and then let himself in. Once inside, the killer walked upstairs to the 3rd floor and walked through an open door into the master bedroom where Lori was fast asleep. But the killer didn't do anything. Instead, the killer darted out of the bedroom, went back downstairs, and spent the next 2 hours pacing around the house while Lori slept upstairs, psyching himself up to go back up there and kill her. And finally, after 2 hours, at about 3 a.m., the killer was ready, so he grabbed his flashlight and other supplies from the trash bag and made his move. He went upstairs and burst into Lori's room and immediately enveloped her head with the t-shirt before she could even wake up. He put his massive weight on top of Lori, pinning her to the bed. Lori couldn't scream, she couldn't move, she couldn't do anything. Then the killer secured a cloth over her mouth with duct tape. The killer tied his rope around Lori's neck like a dog leash and dragged her from the bed across the room. He rifled through Lori's dresser, pulling out a sweater and jeans, and ordered her to change out of her nightgown. Lori complied with his demands, changing into street clothes right in front of him. The killer held the rope so she wouldn't go anywhere, but he averted his gaze. After Lori had changed, the killer wrapped socks around her wrists and then duct taped over them, sealing her wrists together. He didn't want to leave any residue from the tape on her skin, which is why he taped directly on the socks. The killer then forced Lori, who was now bound and gagged, down the stairs into her kitchen. And then once they were down there, he sat her down and took the gag from her mouth. He opened up the bottle of wine that he'd brought along, poured her a full glass, and forced her to drink it as he held it. He kept forcing Lori to drink wine until she'd finished the entire bottle. Then the killer put the gag back in Lori's mouth and led her out to the garage. He opened the back door of her purple minivan and ordered her to lie down across the back seat. Lori was now very drunk, but the killer was still worried about her making a run for it, so he tied her to an armrest and back to make sure she couldn't go anywhere. But after doing this, the killer noticed that the tip of his latex glove had ripped off while he was securing Lori with duct tape. Worried that he might leave a trace of his DNA in this tip of the glove, he ran back inside and back upstairs and scoured the bedroom, but he could never find that piece of latex. Cursing, he rushed back down to the garage. It was now close to 4 a.m., which meant he did not have much time until dawn. So he hopped behind the wheel of the minivan, and using Lori's keys, he turned it on and drove off, with Lori in the back, lying across the back seat, her arms and legs bound. As the killer drove out of town in the minivan, his partner caught up with him and followed in the truck they'd driven to the house. The killer drove about half an hour north of town, where the roads turned to gravel, and then he continued for another 30 minutes through the thick hillsides of Prince of Wales Island. Finally, he pulled over by a creek and pulled Lori out of the car. As for his partner, he parked his truck not far behind them. The killer then put a garbage bag on the ground and laid Lori on top of it to keep her from getting dirty. Getting dirt on Lori's clothes was not part of the plan because he wanted it to look like Lori had had a drunk driving accident. And so, with Lori in place on the trash bag on the ground, the killer crouched over Lori, wrapped his massive hands around her neck, and attempted to break it. He heard a crack, but Lori didn't die. Instead, her gag had slipped off. Lori, breathless and drunk, tried to say something to the killer, and the killer was horrified at the sound of Lori's voice. So he just raised his flashlight over his head and swung it as hard as he could against Lori's neck 12 times, but Lori just kept on breathing. Desperate to finish the job and just get out of there, the killer pinched Lori's nose and covered her mouth with the cloth, suffocating her. Lori struggled as best as she could to get free, but she was bound and gagged and totally intoxicated, and she was way smaller than the killer, and so she was no match. Lori's breath finally gave out, and she died laying on the ground in the middle of nowhere. The killer checked Lori's wrist for a pulse, and when he couldn't find one, he concluded that she was dead. However, after he cut off the tape around Lori's wrists and ankles, he could see there were clear marks on her neck, and there was mud on her clothes despite his efforts to keep mud off of them, and so this made him rethink his plan. He knew this would not look like a drunk driving accident. So, at 5 a.m., the killer put Lori's body back in the purple minivan and pushed the vehicle off the logging road down a steep embankment. It crashed into a fallen tree and came to a stop. The killer's partner had not planned for any of this, but he knew the plan was changing. The killer now wanted to destroy all the evidence. So the partner grabbed a jerry can of gasoline from the truck and rushed over to the killer. The killer then poured that gasoline on the ground, on Lori's body, and all over the minivan. Then he backed away, lit a match, and tossed it onto the gasoline trail leading to the minivan. In 30 seconds, the vehicle had exploded with flames, but there was nobody around to hear it or see it except the killer and the partner. The killer and his partner ran back to the truck, and the two of them drove into town just before the sun started to rise. Once the killer got back to his place, he played some video games and tried to calm down, while his red-haired partner got ready for his janitor shift at the high school. And before he headed to work, he got a phone call from Lori's daughter, Rochelle, and she wanted to know how everything had gone earlier that morning. Jason, who had told police he did not kill Lori, was technically telling the truth. However, he was the partner who drove the truck and helped plan the murder. His friend Brian, who was also friends with Rochelle, had been the one who actually carried out the murder. However, these two were not acting alone. It turned out Rochelle had had sex with both Jason and Brian, and as a result, both of them would do anything for her. For months, Rochelle had complained to them about her mother. Over pizza and video games, she would tell them how Lori hated the way she dressed and took offense at Rochelle's adoption of Wicca, the nature-based religion associated with witchcraft. But most of all, Rochelle would tell them that her mother was really upset about her, Rochelle, hanging out with Jason and Brian. Her mother was afraid that Rochelle could marry someone like them, leading to a dead-end life instead of realizing her true potential. But Rochelle also critically told Jason and Brian that her mother physically abused her, slapping her and even hitting her with a baseball bat. She said her mother also threatened to sell Rochelle into prostitution. But none of Rochelle's stories of abuse were real. They were dark fantasies fueled by real-life mother-daughter friction. However, when she spoke to Jason and Brian about her mother, Lori was made out to be a real-life monster who was going to kill Rochelle unless Jason and Brian put a stop to it. So when Rochelle told Jason and Brian that she and her father would be away the weekend of November 13th, and her mother would be home alone, they knew what they had to do. Investigators had suspected both young men, but it was Jason's bizarre claim that he had been attacked by a stranger with a knife that sealed his and Brian's fate. McFerrin and Claus knew Jason was lying about that knife attack, but they also believed he was lying when he said he did not kill Lori. And so they pressed him, and he would finally admit to helping plan the murder and to driving Brian to the scene. So in exchange for a lesser sentence, investigators got Jason to wear a wire and record Brian talking about the murder. And sure enough, on this wiretap, investigators would hear Brian describe basically everything that happened and who played a role, and so they had enough to arrest both young men and Rochelle. Brian was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 99 years in jail. Jason pled guilty and got a 50-year sentence for his role in planning the murder. As for Rochelle, she actually pled innocent, insisting that she told Jason to stop Brian from going ahead with the plan, but either Jason never relayed the message to Brian or Brian just ignored it. In 2011, Rochelle was found not guilty of murder, but was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide. The jury found that even though Rochelle did not take part in her mother's murder, she clearly knew what Jason and Brian were planning and did very little to stop them. Rochelle served 3 years in prison and was released in 2015. She moved to Florida, where she revived her My Crappy Life blog and continues to maintain it. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts: MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories just like the one you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On an early morning in December of 1991, a woman living in Largo, Florida, woke up to the sound of pounding on her front door. And as she climbed out of her bed, she realized it was not just pounding on her door she was hearing. Also, whoever was out there was screaming for help. When the woman realized there was some sort of crisis here, she kind of rushed and ran to the front door. She opened it up, and standing out on the front porch was her neighbor. And she was practically covered head to toe in blood. Her head was covered in gashes, her throat clearly had been slit, but before this woman could say what was even going on, she just fell to the ground and passed out. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is taking a well-deserved nap, make sure you immediately go over and wake him up with a leaf blower. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of December 14th, 1991, a 31-year-old man named Keith Young grabbed his car keys from a hook by the front door of his home in Largo, Florida. Behind him, his wife, Anita, slipped on her favorite pair of heels. The newlywed couple was about to head out on a much-needed date night. They were both actually on their second marriages, and they had 6 children between them from their previous relationships. So naturally, it was pretty hard to find time for just themselves. But that particular night, Keith's 2 kids were staying with their mother, who had shared custody, and Anita's 8-year-old daughter was at a sleepover, and her 12-year-old son Jason had agreed to stay home and watch his 2 younger siblings so that the adults could go out for dinner. Before they left, Keith gave Jason a final rundown of his expectations. Don't make too much of a mess, make sure nobody gets hurt, and if there was an emergency, he'd written down the restaurant's phone number on a notepad in the kitchen. But Keith reminded Jason that if there were like a real emergency, like a true crisis, he should call 911 right away. And when he heard this, Jason, the 12-year-old, just kind of rolled his eyes and said, "Yeah, I got it. It's under control." Now, Keith knew he was actually being a little bit uptight here, but there'd been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and he'd been on edge about leaving the kids home alone ever since. The intruder had actually cut their phone lines and then also taken off a window screen, and they'd also tried to break down a door as well. But they'd actually left without taking anything, and there hadn't been any more issues in the months since. But critically, the suspect was never caught, so it felt kind of unresolved and scary for the family. Keith and Anita both hugged Jason goodbye as they walked out the door. And then once the door closed behind them, Keith turned around and checked the handle to double check that he'd locked it, just to be safe. Less than a half hour later, Keith and Anita sat down across from each other at the restaurant and unfolded their napkins onto their laps. They were excited to have a few hours of peace and quiet, where they could just, focus on each other, something that didn't happen very often. The couple had gotten married earlier that year after meeting at a support group for single parents, and they were very grateful to have each other, because their previous marriages were really not that great. Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass, had a violent temper, and even though he now lived all the way across the country in Idaho, he still found a way to always complicate Anita's life. That summer, Luther had driven all the way to Keith and Anita's house to take his kids on a vacation, which Anita had initially agreed to, but when he showed up, he was unexpectedly driving a camper with his new girlfriend and her kids. And at that point, Anita had gotten a really bad feeling about the whole situation, and she actually started to worry that Luther would take her kids and then refuse to give them back. And so they had this big argument, and it got so bad that actually Anita had threatened to call the police before Luther finally backed off and left. Meanwhile, Keith had been having equally heated arguments with his ex-spouse, Linda, about whether their kids would spend the upcoming holidays with him or with Linda and her new husband, Steve. Things had gotten so nasty that Linda had actually recently begun harassing Anita over the phone and was also gearing up to go to court and try to get the custody agreement changed if Keith wouldn't agree to do things her way. But their bad relationships with their exes only made Keith more happy that he'd found Anita. He was glad that he could take care of her and her kids the way he felt like they deserved. So despite all the tension hanging over them, he tried to keep the mood light, and they enjoyed a very nice dinner. And then when the check came, Keith glanced at his watch and realized it was getting pretty late. He knew Anita's son Jason was a responsible kid and that he could definitely handle getting his younger siblings into bed, but Keith was still a bit worried about leaving the kids alone for too long. So he paid the check right away, and then he and Anita left the restaurant and drove home. A little while later, Keith and Anita pulled up outside of their brown single-story home. When they got inside, Keith was relieved to see that all the kids were calmly watching TV in the living room and the family cat was curled up on the couch right next to them. Keith told them that it was time to get ready for bed. And as 12-year-old Jason got up, Keith pulled him in for a big hug and told him he was proud of him for his hard work babysitting. Anita helped the younger kids brush their teeth, and then afterwards, Keith turned off the lights and he went down the hall and said goodnight to all three kids, who slept in bunk beds in the same room. Then, after that, he continued down the hallway to the main bedroom and climbed into bed with Anita. He kissed his wife goodnight and then turned off the light. Several hours later, around 3 a.m. early the next morning, Anita's 12-year-old son Jason awoke to a very loud noise, and when he heard it, he sat up in bed. And then he could hear something thumping around in the room next to him. But before he could figure out what was going on, someone screamed. With his vision still blurry from sleep, Jason slid off the top bunk and walked over to the door and cracked it open. And in the dark hallway, he could quickly make out the shadowy shapes of what appeared to be two men moving around, sort of struggling with each other, fighting. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that one of these men was his stepdad, Keith, but he couldn't make out anything about the other man, except that he was really big and wearing what appeared to be a black ski mask. Jason immediately felt paralyzed by fear, because he knew, this was obviously another intruder, just like the one who tried to break into their house that summer. For a second, he was hopeful that maybe his stepdad would fend the man off, but then Jason noticed there was blood sprayed all over the walls, and then he saw the glint of a knife in the intruder's hand. The intruder had Keith pinned to the ground and was stabbing him over and over again. At the same moment, Jason saw his mother, Anita, run out of the master bedroom, also covered in blood, and she was holding a baseball bat. And she swung it at the intruder, and she hit him in the back of the head, but it barely slowed him down. And that's when Jason heard his stepdad yell out for Anita to get the gun. And Anita, she ran into another room, and Jason just stood there looking out the crack, just paralyzed with shock, watching as this intruder literally picked Keith up and threw him back into the master bedroom. And the next thing Jason knew, he saw his mother standing in the hallway holding a gun, and the intruder was running away out the front door. Suddenly, Jason kind of snapped out of the shocked trance he had found himself in and remembered what Keith had told him to do in case of a real emergency. Call 911. So he ran to the phone in the kitchen, he picked it up, and he dialed. But when he put the receiver to his ear, all he heard was silence. There was no dial tone. Jason looked over and he saw his mother kind of hobbling over towards him. She was standing in the doorway, and there was blood visibly dripping down her neck. Jason's voice cracked when he told his mother that the phone line was dead. Anita told her son to go back with his stepdad and just wait, that she was going to go find help. And so Jason began to walk towards the bedroom where he knew his stepdad was, and as he did, he watched his mom run out the front door into the night. And then Jason, he went down the hallway and went into the bedroom where he saw his stepdad sprawled out on the bed. And he was still alive, but he was clearly struggling to breathe. He's kind of gasping and, gurgling. And Jason, this 12-year-old kid, not having any idea how to handle this, just walked over to the bed, kneeled down, and he took Keith's hand and just held it while he waited for his mom. And as he held Keith's hand, he could hear the sound of his stepfather take his last few raspy breaths before he went completely limp. Several hours later, before dawn on the morning of December 15th, 1991, Detective Mike Short from the Largo Police Department pulled up to the curb outside of a brown single-story house surrounded by crime scene tape. He'd gotten a call from his supervisor, who really didn't know much, just that an intruder had broken into this house and attacked a husband and wife while they slept. But now, as Short got out of his car and looked around at the quiet block of modest, well-kept houses, he found that kind of odd. This really wasn't a neighborhood where they saw violent home invasions. As Short walked up to the house, a uniformed officer caught up with him and gave him a few more details about what they knew so far. He said that the wife, Anita Young, had run to a neighbor's house screaming for help before passing out from blood loss in their front yard, and the husband, Keith Young, was deceased in the bedroom. The officer also said that the couple's 12-year-old son had woken up at some point and witnessed the attack, and for now, he was over at the neighbor's house until they could track down another guardian. The officer said that Anita had been taken to a hospital, but it would be a miracle if she survived. Her injuries were some of the worst they'd ever seen. As Short went up the walkway that led to the front door, he saw that blood had dripped all over the cement. The front door was open, and right inside he saw a baseball bat lying on the floor with blood on the handle. Short stepped inside and he saw more blood that was spattered and smeared basically all over the living room, on the walls, the doors, the furniture, as if the suspect and the victims had been fighting all throughout the house. In fact, it was so chaotic and messy that Short thought maybe the suspect was not expecting to fight off two grown adults. Otherwise, they might have come up with a better plan of attack. So Short's first assumption was that this likely was a robbery that had gone terribly wrong. As he continued down the hallway, a cat ran past him. It was unharmed, and it went to hide under the couch. The hallway was somewhat unbelievably even bloodier than the living room, with red smears all over the walls and floors. So Short figured most of the attack must have occurred here. Short reached the main bedroom and looked inside, and he saw Keith's body lying on the bed, covered head to toe in blood. Keith's shirt was shredded, and Short could see there were multiple stab wounds to his chest and also a very deep gash down his side. Short decided not to actually go into the bedroom until crime scene techs had gone through it for forensic evidence. So instead, he just walked down the rest of the hallway and pushed open the door to another bedroom, where he was surprised to see two small children soundly asleep in their bunk beds. Somehow, these kids had slept through the entire attack. Short went back outside and immediately flagged down a uniformed officer, and he told him to go in there and wake up those kids and bring them somewhere safe. Then once the officer went inside, Short pulled out his flashlight and began searching the yard for evidence. Based on Keith's wounds, at least what he saw, Short thought he was probably attacked with a knife, or maybe even an axe or a machete. But apart from that bloody baseball bat that was found in the doorway, there was no sign of a weapon anywhere inside or outside of the house. But as Short went around the side of the house, he found something else that was interesting. The home's phone lines had clearly been cut. The killer must have planned ahead to make sure nobody in this house could call out for help. And this was interesting because nothing else about the scene suggested that this crime was carefully planned. In fact, in some ways you could say it looked like it was very unplanned. But now, Short had to consider that maybe this was not just a random robbery gone wrong. Maybe, especially given the cut phone lines, this was like a premeditated attack, a premeditated murder. And if that was the case, he had to figure out who the intended target was: Keith, or Anita, or both. A little while later, Detective Short walked up the street to the neighbor's house to speak with his best eyewitness, Anita's 12-year-old son, Jason. After Short knocked on the door, the neighbors let him inside and showed him into their living room, where he saw Jason was wrapped in a blanket and still wearing his pajamas. Short sat down across from him and told him that he knew it must be extremely difficult to talk about this, but he really needed to know exactly what he had seen and what he had heard during this attack. Tears began to roll down Jason's face as he began to describe watching his mother and stepfather fight off this intruder. Jason said he couldn't really describe what this person looked like because they were wearing a ski mask, but he was pretty sure it was a man. He also said there had been a little bit of skin exposed on the killer's neck, and from the looks of it, it appeared like their skin was maybe fairly dark, so Short wrote down that the suspect likely had dark skin. But because it was dark, and Jason clearly had not gotten a very good look at the killer, he knew the boy could be wrong too. So he was just putting it down as a maybe. Short asked Jason if the intruder had said anything during the attack, and Jason just shook his head and said no. He said the intruder didn't say a single word the entire time. And Short made note of that too, because it made him wonder if maybe the killer was someone close to the family, and they knew that if they spoke, someone might recognize their voice, like Jason. Later that same morning, once the sun had come up, Short went back to Keith and Anita's house and searched the outside of the property again, in case he missed anything when it was dark. And while he was searching the front yard, another police cruiser pulled up to the curb. An officer got out and walked over to Short. She asked if he was the lead investigator on this case, and when he said he was, the officer told him that she'd been waiting at the hospital all morning and Anita had finally woken up enough to say a few words. She said Anita was only awake for just a few minutes before she had to be rushed back into surgery, but it was long enough to answer a couple of questions. Anita had described waking up to see a man standing over her with an axe in one hand and a knife in the other. She said it was a man that she had never seen before. She didn't recognize anything about him. The officer said right before Anita was taken off to surgery, there was one more thing she mentioned. There had been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and the intruder, during that break-in, had also cut their phone lines. Short instinctively turned and literally looked at the side of the house where those lines had been cut, and he thought to himself, this is too strange of a coincidence to be ignored. Later that day, back at the station, Short read through reports on the interviews his team had done with Keith and Anita's kids and their neighbors. A team of 5 detectives had been assigned to this case, and they'd made quick progress on collecting background information on the victims. Everybody in the neighborhood had described the victims as being a very normal, happy couple. Keith was an air conditioning technician who'd been working at the same company for a very long time, and Anita was mostly a stay-at-home mom who did some accounting work on the side. However, what also came out in these interviews was that both Keith and Anita had ex-spouses who could potentially want to hurt them. Anita's ex-husband, Luther, lived thousands of miles away in Boise, Idaho, but Short knew that despite the distance, it was not impossible that he might have traveled to Florida to commit this crime. So Short called the Boise police and told them about this attack, and asked them to track down Luther and question him. As for Keith's ex-wife, Linda, Short had learned that she actually lived right there in town, and Keith's 2 kids were still at her house, unaware that their father was dead. And since Linda and her new husband Steve were potential suspects, Short wanted to be the one to break the news to them, to see how they all reacted. So he looked up Linda's address in the database, and then grabbed his keys and headed out. Less than an hour later, Short parked his car in Linda's driveway and walked up to the front door. He knocked, and a woman opened the door, and Short asked her if she was Linda, and she said yes. And then he flashed his badge and said he'd like to come in. And Linda, she seemed a bit confused, but she opened the door and let him inside. Short walked into what seemed like a perfectly normal Sunday morning routine inside of the house. The air smelled like eggs and bacon, and the 2 kids were in the living room watching cartoons with a man who Short figured must be Linda's new husband Steve. And so Short, he asked Steve to leave the kids and come into the kitchen with he and Linda, because he wanted to speak to both of them. And then once all 3 of them had sat down at the kitchen table, Short broke the news that Keith had been murdered. And then Short watched as Linda literally collapsed into Steve's arms. Short gave them a minute, but then he cut right to the chase, and he asked where Linda and Steve had been at about 3 a.m. that morning. Linda seemed shocked to realize that clearly the detective was considering both her and her husband as suspects, but she choked out that they'd both been at home with the kids sleeping. And Steve just nodded in agreement. He said they'd all been home together all night, that was it. Nothing about their demeanor or their reactions was suspicious to Short. But when he pressed Linda about what her relationship with her ex-husband was like, she admitted that it was contentious, and that actually just a couple of days earlier, she'd spoken to a lawyer about potentially changing their custody agreement. Short found the timing of this a little convenient, and he wondered, maybe Linda or Steve had decided they would just settle the custody battle by simply taking Keith out of the picture for good. And he also found it convenient that Linda and Keith's 2 kids weren't at Keith's house when the attack happened. It was only Anita's kids who were there at the time. But Short thanked the couple for their time and told them he would be in touch if he had any more questions. And then he left their house, and as he got into his car and drove back to the station, he kept going over the conversation he had just had in his mind. Linda and Steve's alibis were pretty weak. They seemed to be the only 2 people who could vouch for their whereabouts for the night of the murder, and so what that meant was Short had every reason to keep both of them at the very top of his suspect list. Late that night, Short was sitting at his desk in his office when his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the police in Boise, Idaho. They'd managed to track down Anita's ex-husband, Luther. Short immediately sat up straight and grabbed a pencil to take notes. The officer on the line told him that when they'd gotten to Luther's house, he wasn't there. but his fiancée, Connie, was. And she told them that he'd been out on a weekend hunting trip. So the officers had gone out and searched for Luther in the area where he said he'd been hunting, but they didn't find him until that evening when Luther actually arrived back at his house. The officer said, at that point they took him in for questioning, and he had told them the same thing that Connie had, that he'd been out elk hunting about an hour away from Boise all weekend. Luther had been able to describe basically every step of his hunting trip in great detail, but since he had been hunting alone, there was nobody to corroborate his alibi. Now, Short knew that the drive from Boise to Largo, Florida, where the attack took place, took at least 3 or 4 days. So the fact that Luther was in Boise less than 24 hours after the murders meant that he could not have driven there. But there was still a possibility that if he was involved, maybe he could have flown. Now, Short knew it would be difficult, but not impossible, for Luther to catch a plane to Florida and back during the time that he was supposedly out hunting. So he told the Boise officer to look into whether Luther had recently purchased an airline ticket and to also take saliva, blood, and hair samples from Luther. After Short hung up the phone, he just sat back in his chair and thought for a second. It was less than 24 hours into this investigation, and Short already had 3 suspects in his crosshairs: Keith's ex-wife Linda, and Linda's new husband Steve, and also Anita's ex-husband Luther. And then also, to some degree, Luther's fiancée, Connie, could have been involved, but based on logistics and the fact that she was at the house, it seemed unlikely. But there was one big problem. Based on Anita and Jason's eyewitness testimony, the suspect they were looking for was a dark-skinned man who Anita had never met before, and that description would not apply to any of their suspects. Short knew that the suspect description might not be reliable. After all, it had been dark in the house, so Jason could have been wrong about the killer's skin color, and Anita was barely conscious during her interview, so her recollections might not be accurate at all. But if it was accurate, it could mean any number of things for Short's investigation. It could mean it was a random robbery after all, just some random person who went in the house and did this horrible thing. It could also mean that, one of his current suspects had maybe hired somebody to commit the crime. Or it could mean that all Short's theories about the case were just completely wrong, and he had no idea what happened. Short rubbed his eyes and looked at the clock and realized it was almost midnight, so he decided it was time to go home and get some sleep. Maybe, he hoped, by morning, a new piece of evidence might turn up that would help point him in the right direction. Around 7 a.m. the next morning, so about 28 hours after Keith's murder, Short pulled into the parking lot of Pinecrest Golf Course, which was less than a mile away from Keith and Anita's house. And at this very moment, Short was feeling really optimistic about the case, because a groundskeeper at this golf course had called the police that morning and said they'd found a ski mask and a glove lying in the grass. So now, Short got out of his car and he went into the clubhouse, and the groundskeeper was there waiting for him. And he said he had left the ski mask and the glove right outside, right where he had found them. So Short followed the groundskeeper out onto the course, and as they walked, Short made note of all the ponds scattered around and also the lake at the park right across the street. He wondered if maybe the killer might have tossed their weapon or weapons into the water. A minute later, the groundskeeper stopped walking and pointed down at the ground, at a black ski mask and a dark-colored cotton glove lying in the grass, exactly as promised. And so Short put on a pair of latex gloves and he knelt down and he carefully lifted up the mask. And as he did, he felt that clearly it was crusted with something reddish-brown, very likely dried blood. As soon as Short got back to the station, he sent the mask and the glove off to the crime lab for testing, hoping that they might find a trace of the killer's DNA. Then Short spoke to his supervisor about sending a team of divers out to search the water at the golf course and also that park, in case the murder weapons had been disposed of in any of those water bodies. It seemed like a long shot that they would actually find something, but it was the best lead they had so far, and finding the weapon or weapons could really help them narrow down their suspect list. And by the time Short got back to his desk, he saw that his answering machine was blinking. There was a new message. And so he hit play, and the message was from a man who said he had information on the Keith Young case. So Short called him back right away. And when the man answered, he said he was a college student who lived a block away from Keith and Anita Young's house, and he said on the night of the murder, he and his friends had been hanging out in his driveway, and they'd seen a man jogging east down Coronet Avenue. And Short immediately turned and looked at the map on the wall, and he got really excited, because he saw Coronet Avenue was actually the exact path the killer would have had to take to get from Keith and Anita's house to that golf course. Short asked the young man to describe this jogger, and the college student said that it appeared to be a white man with short dark hair. Short asked him if he was pretty sure about that, and the student said yeah. In fact, the jogger had passed under a streetlight at one point, so they all got a pretty good look. This was a huge development, since 12-year-old Jason, one of the eyewitnesses, had said the killer had dark skin. It was very possible now that maybe Jason was wrong. But it was also possible that there were now two men involved in the attack. Maybe one had dark skin and one had light skin. The following week, Short opened up a folder that had just been sent over from the police in Northport, Florida, a town 85 miles away. On December 19th, so just 4 days after Keith Young was murdered, a man and 3 kids in Northport, Florida were shot to death in the middle of the night inside of their home. The suspects in that attack were 2 men wearing ski masks, and they had cut the house's phone lines. So the similarities between these 2 killings were easy to see, but as far as Short could tell, the victims in the second attack didn't have any connections to the Youngs. Plus, the victims in the second attack had been shot instead of stabbed. And so as Short really did try to look for all the similarities he could between the 2 crime scenes, he just couldn't get over how sort of blatantly personal the very violent and bloody attack felt at the Youngs' house. So even though there was this other, on the surface, similar killing in Florida, and even though Jason and Anita both swore they did not recognize the intruder, Short was not ready to rule out that Keith Young had been killed by someone who knew him. His strongest suspect was still Anita's ex-husband Luther, who claimed to have been out hunting alone at the time of the attack. As for Anita, her condition had actually finally stabilized, and when Short had gone to speak to her at the hospital, she had said that Luther was really the only person she could think of who might want to hurt her, because they'd been arguing a lot about custody and also child support. But the Boise police had checked with every airline in the country, and none of them had a record of Luther flying into Florida that weekend. So Short couldn't even prove that Luther was in the state at the time of the attack. And then also, Anita had mentioned that she'd been having problems with Keith's ex-wife, Linda. She said that Linda had been harassing her all summer long, calling her so many times that she couldn't even use her own phone. Short definitely still had his eye on Linda, but he still hadn't found anything directly linking Linda or her new husband Steve to the crime. But Short was still very hopeful that this case would get solved, because a preliminary report from the forensics lab had just come in that said a Caucasian hair had been discovered inside the black ski mask that was found on the golf course, which could point to any one of Short's main suspects. And Short knew it was only a matter of time before the forensics lab finished its full analysis of that hair sample, and then they would know for sure if it was an exact match. One day in early January of 1992, so a few weeks after Keith's murder, Detective Short got into the office and checked his answering machine, and he found that he'd gotten a message from the forensics lab telling him to call back right away. And so right away he picked up the phone and dialed the number, and he could feel his heart pounding as the line rang. This could finally be the break in the case he'd been waiting for. And when the technician picked up, he told Short that, they had analyzed that hair in the mask, and they'd analyzed the DNA. But it was not a match for Short's top suspect, Anita's ex-husband, Luther. Not a match. Short thanked the technician and hung up, feeling very disappointed. Now, this still didn't fully rule Luther out, especially because Short still thought there might have been maybe 2 suspects involved. But he decided that at this point, it was time for investigators to really focus on other possibilities. Several weeks later, so in early 1992, roughly a couple of months after Keith Young's murder, Detective Short knocked on the front door of Linda's house. Linda is Keith's ex-wife. And when Linda opened the door and saw the detective once again standing outside her house, she quickly let him inside. The house was quiet, and Linda told Short that she was the only one home. They sat down in the living room, and then they ran through all the subjects that Short had grilled her on the first time around. Her alibi, her custody disputes, her tense relationship with Keith, and none of her answers changed, and she really didn't say anything that could be viewed as incriminating. But as their conversation began to wrap up, Linda looked anxious, like there was something more she wanted to say. Short asked her what was going on, and she said that there was something she hadn't mentioned when they had spoken the first time. It was about her new husband, Steve. She said that a while back, after she and Steve had gotten married, that briefly she had rekindled her relationship with Keith. Steve had found out that she was cheating on him, and he was naturally very upset. Linda said that a few months ago, Steve had even made a few jokes about hurting Keith. At the time, she didn't think he was serious, but after Keith was killed, she started worrying that Steve might have somehow been involved. She said that she had even gone so far as to check Steve's knife collection to make sure none of them were missing. Short was careful not to let his shock come across his face, but inside, his mind was absolutely spinning. He'd always thought it was possible that Linda and Steve were both in on the murder, but now it sounded like maybe Steve might have acted alone. He also wondered, though, if Linda was ratting out her husband to draw suspicion away from herself. So, to help get to the bottom of it, he asked Linda to come with him back to the station for a polygraph test. He also planned to order another polygraph for Steve, who was suddenly at the very top of his suspect list. But almost 2 months later, in March of 1992, Short was back in his office staring down at a pile of documents he'd already read over 1,000,000 times, and the evidence still didn't point him toward anybody in particular. Linda and Steve had both taken their polygraph tests, but the results did not indicate they were guilty, and there was still no hard evidence that tied either of them to the crime. Also, after searching all the ponds and that lake in the area, police still had not found a murder weapon. And they'd still not been able to match that strand of hair from the presumed killer's ski mask to any of the suspects on their radar. Short still had really 3 main suspects who could have been responsible for the murder. There was Keith's ex-wife Linda, who had been fighting with him about custody. Her alibi was weak and only supported by her new husband Steve, who she had been suspicious of when Short interviewed her for a second time. And so Steve was also one of his primary suspects because he had this, terrible history with Keith and had even openly joked about, hurting Keith. And then there was Luther, Anita's hot-headed ex-husband who lived on the other side of the country. Now, it would have been possible for him to fly from Idaho to Florida and commit this crime, but there was no proof that he did. And of course, there was still the possibility that this was just a random attack or a robbery gone wrong. And investigators still couldn't even be sure if they were looking for 1 or 2 or more suspects. They had no idea. So Short had plenty of theories, but still no evidence to back any of them up. The investigation had gone so cold that the task force assigned to the case had been reduced from 5 detectives to just 2. Short was starting to fear that Keith's murder might never be solved. But just then, Short's phone rang. And when he picked up the receiver, a voice said that they knew something about that previous break-in attempt at Keith and Anita's house a few months before Keith's murder. And as Detective Short listened to what this caller had to say, he suddenly knew exactly who had broken into that house and killed Keith and tried to kill Anita. Based on all the collected evidence, as well as the killer's eventual partial confession, this is what investigators believe happened to Keith and Anita Young on the morning of December 15th, 1991. At 3 a.m., the killer saw that all the windows in Keith and Anita's house were dark. So they carefully snuck around the side of the home and cut the phone lines, just like they'd done a few months before. The first time, they'd second-guessed themselves and didn't go through with what they had planned. But this time was going to be different. The killer broke into the house very easily, feeling very calm and in control. They had an axe in their right hand and a knife in their left. As they made their way through the living room, they heard growling and hissing, and they looked down to see the family's cat standing in their path. They thought about strangling the cat to shut it up, but decided not to. They wanted to do this with as little collateral damage as possible. So they bent down and tried to soothe the cat, and when it worked and the cat became quiet, the killer stepped past the cat and began walking down the hall. They made it to the master bedroom, they opened up the door and stepped inside. Anita and Keith were fast asleep in their beds, and so the killer quietly walked over to the side of the bed that Anita was on, and they stood there looking down at her, getting ready to do what they felt like they had to do. But as the killer was looking down at Anita stirred awake, and for a brief second, she looked up and locked eyes with the killer. And the killer instinctively just swung the axe down, hitting Anita squarely in the head. but she fought back and she shouted out Keith's name to wake him up. And the next thing the killer knew, Keith was on top of them, pulling them away from Anita. And so the killer began hitting Keith with the axe as well, but even despite being hit about 3 times, Keith would not let up. And so they struggled and shoved each other, and their fight kind of spilled out of the bedroom into the main portion of the house. I mean, this was not how the killer had hoped this would go. They'd wanted to get this done quickly and leave without anybody waking up, but they'd clearly underestimated Keith. No matter how many times the killer stabbed him or hacked at him with the axe, he didn't stop fighting. And then as the killer and Keith continued sort of fumbling around and making their way back down the hallway, the killer suddenly felt something hard smash into the back of their skull, and they turned to see Anita standing there behind them with blood running down her face and a baseball bat in her hands. The killer heard Keith shout out for Anita to go get the gun, and he saw Anita run toward a nearby closet. The killer also noticed a young boy looking out from a doorway nearby, and so the killer made a split-second decision. They just grabbed Keith and chucked him into the master bedroom, and then the killer sprinted back down the hallway and out the front door. And then when they got to the sidewalk, they removed their ski mask and kind of casually jogged down the street, hoping that to anybody looking outside, they would think the killer was just, an unassuming health nut out for a very early morning run. When they got to a nearby golf course, they stopped on the grass to change their clothes. And then after that, they stole a bike and rode away. Things had not gone the way the killer had hoped. But as they reflected on what they had just done, they thought to themselves that in reality, this actually could have gone worse. I mean, they didn't kill the cat, and critically, no kids have been hurt either. And in some ways, that's what this was all about, to avoid hurting the kids. Because the killer was Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass. He'd wanted to get Anita out of the way so he could have custody of their 4 kids and treat them the way he believed they needed to be treated. And he'd wanted to get Anita out of the way so that he could have custody of his 4 kids. He felt like she was screwing up their lives, that he was the kids' solution. They needed him, and so he had to do this. But Luther's own fiancée, Connie, had ultimately told the Boise police that Luther was the one who had cut Keith and Anita's phone lines a few months back before the murder. And she said she knew Luther had actually flown to Florida on the weekend of the murder, using an alias and fake social security number that he had gotten from his coworker. And once the Boise police finished speaking with Connie, they immediately called Detective Short in Florida to tell him what they'd just learned. It turned out there was no second suspect. It was just Luther. So 12-year-old Jason had just been wrong about the killer's appearance, and Anita had been wrong about not knowing who they were. As for that hair that had been found inside the black ski mask that Luther had been wearing, it's unclear how that was there. It wasn't Luther's hair, but it's possible that maybe somebody else had put the mask on at some point, and that's how it got there. Luther Bass was arrested in Boise, Idaho on March 6, 1992, and he confessed to the crime on the same day. A year later, he was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and burglary with an assault. He was sentenced to life plus 30 years in prison. As for Anita, she would recover from her injuries. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Our stories typically have really big plot twists at the end, and today's story is no different. However, the plot twist today is so unexpected, so abrupt, so horrifying that it really will keep you guessing until the very end. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please change the 4th song on the Amazon Music follow button sleep playlist to the loudest heavy metal death music you can find. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the late summer of 1930, Raphael Pansardi and his wife Leonarda Cianciulli moved with their 4 young kids to a little town in northern Italy called Correggio. A terrible earthquake had destroyed the family's previous village and killed nearly all of their neighbors. And so this family was feeling very lucky to be alive, but when they arrived in Correggio, they really had nothing and were hoping that, the people of this town will just be very welcoming and generous and kind of help them get set up again. And the people of this town did exactly that. Correggio was this beautiful place inside of a fertile valley where people lived in these cottages surrounded by rice fields and mulberry trees. And the people who lived there were very tight-knit and looked after each other and cooked for each other and had parties together. I mean, this was a real community. And so when Raphael and Leonarda arrived, the townspeople immediately found them this cute little cottage by a stream with a whitewashed front door and a beautiful stone hearth for cooking, and there was an attached storefront on this cottage that they were giving them. And then on top of that, once the family had moved in, the family's new neighbors helped get Raphael a job, and they also helped Leonarda set up the attached storefront that was part of their cottage so she could sell her homemade soap bars out of this shop. And so very quickly, the family just completely fell in love with Correggio, especially 36-year-old Leonarda. Losing her home and her previous neighbors in that terrible earthquake had been a tragedy on epic scale, but it was far from the first tragedy that Leonarda had been forced to live through. Leonarda had been born into poverty. Her mother had actually come from a very wealthy family, but they had cut Leonarda's mom off when she became pregnant with Leonarda. And so when Leonarda's mom gave birth to her, she blamed Leonarda for their poverty and all of their problems, and so beat her relentlessly. And then on top of that, Leonarda's father died when she was very young, and so she was stuck at home being abused constantly by her mother. When Leonarda was 21, she met Raphael and fell in love with him, and he was a very kind and gentle man. He really made a very strong first impression on anyone who met him. But when Leonarda went to her mother and introduced Raphael to her and said, "I'm going to marry this man, I love him," her mother flew into a rage and then literally cursed Leonarda. She actually out loud muttered this spell and then told Leonarda that because of this spell, Leonarda would have evil following her forever. Now, of course, Leonarda was very used to her mother's terrible behavior, and so she did not actually think she was at risk of this curse affecting her life in any way. But not long after actually marrying Raphael, Leonarda began to see evidence that this curse might actually be real. It started with Leonarda having these sudden fits of seizures for no particular reason, and then Leonarda, every time she got pregnant, she would miscarry and lose the baby. And so feeling really sad and desperate because all she wanted was a family, Leonarda actually went to a fortune teller in hopes that they would tell her that in the future, her life got better, not worse, which to Leonarda meant, the curse was not real if my life improves. But after this fortune teller took Leonarda's hands and studied her palms, she looked up at Leonarda and gave her grave news. She said, "Leonarda, you're going to have living children, but they're all going to die young. And I see a prison and an insane asylum in your future." This experience totally shocked Leonarda and confirmed for her that her mother's curse must be real. And sure enough, over the following years, Leonarda and Raphael would go on to have 14 living children, and 10 of them would die when they were babies or toddlers. And so by the time Leonarda had arrived in Correggio with her family in 1930, she was absolutely petrified that her last 4 precious children would die because of this curse. And so in order to keep her kids safe, she basically never let them out of her sight, and then she also made sure they always adhered to these strange rules and beliefs that Leonarda had come up with about good and evil that were designed to somehow protect the kids from this curse. But the incredible show of generosity and support and kindness that Leonarda and her family had experienced when they arrived in Correggio had really done something to Leonarda. In fact, it really kind of changed the way she viewed the world. Suddenly, she was less concerned with this curse and how to protect her family from it, and instead, she was just kind of content. She felt safe. She felt happy. The women in the town loved Leonarda and always came by the house to say hi to her and eat some of the amazing tea cakes that she would make. And also Leonarda had become best friends with this woman named Virginia, who was a former opera singer from Milan, who was very elegant and beautiful. And every time she went to a dinner party, she would invite Leonarda. And also, Leonarda and her family were becoming financially stable really for the first time ever. Leonarda's soap shop that she ran out of their cottage was really successful. People came from all around to buy her soaps because nobody could make them like she could. And Raphael's job as a clerk was very steady, and he too was becoming well respected in town. And so because of how well this transition to Correggio had been, at some point Leonarda made a promise both to herself and to the universe that instead of focusing all of her time and energy on this curse, which had plagued her whole life, instead she was going to focus on helping the people of Correggio any way she could because they had done so much for her. And that is exactly what Leonarda did, but in a kind of ironic way. Because of the fear Leonarda had for her mother's curse, she had gone to that fortune teller many years ago. And even though the news she got when she saw the fortune teller was horrible, Leonarda had left that experience kind of fascinated with the art of fortune telling and magic and sorcery. It just really appealed to her. And so now that Leonarda was running this very successful soap shop out of her house, there were all these people coming from far and wide that would ask to barter for her soaps. Bartering is like trading one item for another item versus paying for something outright with money. And so Leonarda began bartering with these travelers whenever they had books about fortune telling, about magic, about sorcery, about how to make potions, about the occult. And after reading through all of these books and learning as much as she could, Leonarda, in addition to selling her soaps, began offering fortune telling services to the people of Correggio. And it would turn out she was really good at predicting the future, to the point where people in town basically began going to her for all kinds of advice. She helped women find love, she told farmers what crops to plant, she created these charm bags for people and told them they would protect them. She also began creating these herb potions for people when they got sick. It actually got to the point where people trusted her so much that when they got sick, they didn't even go to the doctor, they just went to her. And so very quickly, Leonarda felt very proud of the fact that she had lived up to the promise she had made both to herself and to the universe to always help the people of Correggio at every turn. But more than that, Leonarda was starting to think that this newfound sense of purpose and happiness she was getting in helping the people of Correggio through her various services had finally broken her mother's curse. By 1939, Leonarda and her family had been living in Correggio very happily for almost 10 years, and at the time, Leonarda's oldest son, Giuseppe, was 17 years old. Giuseppe was tall, he was handsome, he had dark hair, he had dark eyes, and all the girls loved him. And Giuseppe and Leonarda had always had a very close relationship. Every day, Giuseppe would come home, and he and his mom would sit in the kitchen, and they would chat for a while and eat some of her tea cakes. But now, in 1939, when Giuseppe was 17, he started to act a little bit different. He would come home, and instead of going into the kitchen to sit with Leonarda, he would just go straight to his room and shut the door. And when Leonarda or Raphael would ask him, hey, is everything okay? Giuseppe would get very defensive and say he was fine and to please just leave me alone. But to Leonarda, it seemed really obvious that her son was not fine, and she thought, maybe he has some sort of secret he's keeping, and that's what's making him act this way. He's hurting on the inside, but he can't share it with the world. But Leonarda had no idea what this secret might be. And then one day, late that same year, Leonarda was walking through town when one of her neighbors came up to her and said, "Hey, are you aware that your son Giuseppe has signed up for the military and he's leaving for training in just a few months?" Leonarda had not heard about this. People were talking a lot about World War II, which had just started around this time, but Leonarda had never considered that her precious son would go off to fight in that war. But now, Leonarda realized that Giuseppe's recent strange behavior suddenly made sense. This was the secret he was keeping. He had joined the military, and he hadn't told his family. Leonarda turned around and went straight home. She went right into her bedroom, shut the door, and she just sobbed. To her, it felt like her mother's curse was back, and now her precious son was going to go off into the war, and he was going to die. Unless she found a way to combat this evil that was now following her again. So, for the next several days, Leonarda did not open up her soap shop, she didn't come downstairs, she just stayed locked in her bedroom and read through all of her books about magic and sorcery and the occult, looking for some sort of solution for how to fight this curse. And finally, she figured out what she had to do. She read that if she gave something beautiful to the universe would reward her. And in Leonarda's mind, that reward would be sparing her son. And so Leonarda decided that the most beautiful thing she could offer the universe would be to help the people of Correggio, which she was already doing, but in her mind, she thought she could really ramp up her efforts and really try to change people's lives. And she thought if she could do that, the universe was sure to notice and it would save her son's life. Leonarda decided that the first person she would really go above and beyond to help inside of Correggio was a woman named Faustina. Faustina, who was in her 70s, was desperate to get married, but to many people in town, including Leonarda, she seemed kind of beyond help. She was totally antisocial, she was awkward, and just kind of given her age, it seemed like marriage was just not in the cards for her. But this is where Leonarda thought she could step in and change everything for Faustina. She would find her a husband. So Leonarda reached out to Faustina and told her about a friend of hers, a man who lived in a city to the north, who was also alone in his old age and who was likely looking for marriage, and she could set them up if Faustina was interested. And so Faustina was immediately interested and wanted to meet this guy, but Leonarda did tell her that, this guy, the reason he's not married is he's kind of difficult to be around, he's kind of a jerk, but he's got a wonderful heart, he means well, I think he'd be a great fit for you. And so again, Faustina's like, great, I want to meet him, I want to marry him, I'm ready. And then finally, the day came when Faustina actually went to this other town and met this guy in person, and they fell in love. And Faustina just moved right in with him, and before long, she was sending happy postcards back to Correggio, telling everyone about how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help in setting them up. And so Leonarda was obviously thrilled not only for her friend's happiness, but also it really felt like she had checked the box in terms of really going above and beyond to help someone in Correggio in an effort to get the universe to spare her son. But her son was still a couple months away from leaving for training, and Leonarda, she's very superstitious, and she's thinking, okay, I don't know if that was enough to get the universe to save my son. And so I need to find somebody else I can help. So in September of 1940, Leonarda began her next good deed project with another woman in town. She was a widow in her 50s named Francesca. She had worked as a teacher, but when her husband got sick, she quit her job, and then when her husband ultimately died, she was left with nothing. So Leonarda reached out to Francesca and told her that she, Leonarda, would be willing to reach out to her own mother's rich family to see if maybe they had a job they could finesse for Francesca. Now, of course, Leonarda was not excited about talking to her mother's family, who had disowned her mother and had shown no interest in Leonarda. But Leonarda wanted to do this for Francesca and for the sake of her son and getting the universe to notice what she was doing. And so sure enough, Leonarda would reach out to her mother's family, and they were remarkably open to the idea, and they got a job for Francesca in Switzerland. And so eventually, Francesca jetted off to Switzerland, and then a couple of days later, she was sending postcards back to Correggio, saying how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help. And so again, Leonarda was so happy about this outcome, both because she cared about Francesca and also because this was yet another kind of check in the box of her good deeds that the universe was going to notice that in turn would save her son. But again, after Francesca didn't need any more help, Leonarda found herself looking at her son, who was getting closer and closer to leaving for training, and she would think to herself, have I done enough to protect him? Have I really stopped this curse from killing him after he leaves? And Leonarda eventually decided that no, she had not done enough. She needed to do at least one more really big good deed for someone in this town. And who better to help than her best friend, Virginia, the former opera singer? Leonarda knew from all her talks with Virginia that Virginia really missed living in the big city and going to the opera house. And so Leonarda reached out to Virginia and said, you know what? I can reach out to my mother's rich family and maybe they can find a job for you in a big city if you're interested. And so Virginia was like, wow, yes, I would love that. That's an amazing opportunity. And so Leonarda again would contact her mother's rich family, and again, they came through, finding this job as a social planner for this very rich guy in Florence, Italy, who often funded plays and operas. And so this job was perfect for Virginia. When Leonarda told Virginia about this opportunity, Virginia cried tears of joy. After packing up all of her things, Virginia made a stop at Leonarda's house to say goodbye and thank you, and the two women would hug and laugh and cry, they would drink wine together, and then finally, when it was time for Virginia to go, even though Leonarda was very sad, she was also quite happy, because finally she felt like this good deed was enough to get the universe to spare her son. However, Leonarda, being a very superstitious person, did have one more little thing she wanted to do with Giuseppe before he left for the military. And this little thing was her, Leonarda, bathing her son, her 18-year-old son, with a particular bar of soap, and then she also wanted to feed him a special kind of tea cake that she was going to make. The soap and the tea cake had these special herbs and ingredients and different things she had pulled from her books of magic and the occult, and they would kind of form like a protective barrier both outside and inside of Giuseppe. So on the same night that Virginia headed off to Florence, when Giuseppe came home, Leonarda approached him and said, I want to give you this bath and I want to feed you these tea cakes. And Giuseppe was not remotely enthused at the idea of having his mom bathe him. He's 18. But he knew she was highly superstitious, she seemed pretty emotional about this, and it just seemed like it was extremely important to her, and so he said, okay. And so Leonarda washed her son with this special kind of magic soap, and then she also gave him the tea cakes, and then afterward, even though Giuseppe was really annoyed by what he had just been asked to do, Leonarda was so happy she was practically floating. She felt like she had done everything she could possibly do, and now she could just relax because her son was safe. But soon, Leonarda would learn that that was not actually true. A few days after giving her son the magical last bath and magical tea cakes, the police showed up at the front door of Leonarda's house. And when she opened the door and saw the police, she asked what was going on, and the police would say to her, hey, the 3 women that you supposedly helped that left town recently, they've all been reported missing by their families. They don't know where they are. And so Leonarda, she was totally shocked by this. And she said, no, that's not possible. I write to them all the time. I get postcards that come in very regularly from all of them. And then Leonarda went and got the postcards and showed the police, like, look, I'm talking to them. How could they possibly be missing? And so the police, they would look at these letters and they would agree with Leonarda that it is pretty strange that she'd be getting these very authentic seeming letters from these women if these women were also missing. And so eventually the police would leave and they would tell Leonarda that they would be in touch if they needed anything. And then over the next couple of days, Leonarda was very concerned about these 3 women, but she received numerous postcards from these women over those several days, and all of these postcards were totally normal seeming. And so Leonarda was fairly confident that whatever was going on with the police had to have been a mix-up, and she wouldn't be hearing from them again. But a couple of weeks later, the police did come back to Leonarda's house, except this time they didn't knock, they just barged right in. After the police had spoken with Leonarda that first time, they did some digging on these letters that she was receiving, and they managed to trace them all back to their start point. And it turned out all of these letters from all 3 of these women were originating from one place. It was this little town to the north of Correggio. And when police went to this little town, they discovered that these letters that were starting in this little town were all being mailed by the same person. And they got a physical description of this person who apparently was pretending to be these 3 women. And the description was of a tall, handsome young man with dark hair and dark eyes. It was Giuseppe. After the police barged into Leonarda's house, they went straight to Giuseppe's room where they accused him of murdering those 3 women, and then they hauled him out of the house and brought him to the station to question him about where he dumped the bodies. When the last police officer left Leonarda's house, Leonarda walked outside and just stood there wondering what she was going to do. It was like she had done everything in her power to protect her son from this curse, but somehow this curse she knew had done this to her son. And so now she knew there was only one thing she could do. Without saying anything to her husband, she went inside, she got her things, and she began making her way to the police station. At this point in her life, Leonarda looked much older than her actual age of 46. She had very gray hair, her face was very wrinkled, and she was stooped over, and she was always carrying these charm bags and magical potions and little stick figures that she claimed protected her family. And so her overall appearance when she wandered into the police station was that of a very frail old woman who was also very strange. And so Leonarda hobbled her way up to the front desk, and in a trembling voice, she asked the attendant if she could speak to the detective who was working on her son's case. And then a moment later, she was led into an interview room where she was told to wait. And then a little while later, the lead detective walked into the room, he sat down across the table from Leonarda, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And immediately, Leonarda said, "My son, Giuseppe, is innocent." And the detective, when he heard this, he was not remotely surprised. In fact, this is fully what he expected this conversation was going to be. He knew Leonarda loved her son very much, and of course she was going to say he was innocent. This is what parents typically did in cases like this. But the detective decided he wouldn't try to stop her. He would just let this very distraught mother kind of talk for a bit. He would tell her that he would follow up on whatever she was saying, and then he would drive her back home. But this detective was not expecting the things that would come out of Leonarda's mouth over the next couple of hours. In fact, her story about why Giuseppe was innocent was so shocking and so bizarre that the detective outright said, "I don't believe you. I don't believe this. This can't be true." And then other officers were called in to listen to her story to see if they believed it. And they too said, "This doesn't seem real." But the police would follow up on the details she gave, and it all checked out. It would turn out, back in late 1939, on the day that Faustina, the first woman that Leonarda pledged to help in order to get the universe to save her son, when Faustina was set to go north and meet her future husband, Faustina stopped by Leonarda's house to say bye. And when she was in Leonarda's house, something very unexpected happened. When Faustina walked into Leonarda's kitchen where Leonarda was, Faustina was so excited about meeting her potential future husband that her hands were shaking and she was smiling ear to ear. And so Leonarda said to Faustina, "Hey, you need to calm down." And so she handed Faustina a glass of wine. And so Faustina took the wine and she had a couple of sips of wine. And right away, Faustina started feeling dizzy. And before long, she was grabbing the table just to keep from falling over. It would turn out the wine was poisoned by Leonarda. And so Faustina, she's kind of looking up at Leonarda, and Leonarda is looking down at her, and she's got an axe in one of her hands. And she says to Faustina, "I'm so sorry." And then she winds up and she strikes Faustina in the chest with the axe and lodges it in her chest. And so she lets go of it, expecting Faustina to die. She doesn't. Faustina's just standing there with an axe in her chest. And so Leonarda grabbed the handle of the axe, she pulled it out of her chest, and then began wailing on her head over and over and over again until Faustina did fall to the ground dead. Then Leonarda lit a fire under her big metal pot on the stove, and then she cut Faustina's body into 9 pieces, she drained the blood out of the body into a bucket, and then she chucked those 9 pieces into the pot on the stove and began to mix them with caustic soda, which is a powerful dissolving agent that's used to make soap. And then she boiled the ingredients, her body parts and this caustic soda, for hours. Faustina's body slowly turned into this horrible black mush inside of this pot, and Leonarda was watching this the whole time, and she just had a look of total disappointment as this was happening. And then at some point, she just took the pot off the stove and dumped the ingredients, Faustina's body, down the septic tank. And then Leonarda waited for Faustina's blood that she had dumped out to coagulate, which means it became semi-solid. And then she heated it up in the oven and then ground it into flour. And she would use that flour to make tea cakes, which she fed to her friends the next day, as well as her son, Giuseppe. Leonarda also asked her son to mail some letters for her from the little town to the north where Faustina had supposedly gone. These letters, of course, were written by Leonarda pretending to be Faustina to give the impression that she was still alive and well. And Giuseppe, when he was told to go mail these letters, didn't think anything of it. He was used to doing errands for his mom. Even though Leonarda basically got away with killing Faustina, her plan for Faustina had not really gone the way Leonarda had hoped. When she boiled Faustina's chopped up body parts and this caustic soda, they didn't really mix the way she wanted them to. Leonarda was convinced that the reason for this is because Faustina was too skinny, and so there wasn't enough fat on her body for the mix to be perfect. So Leonarda had come up with another elaborate story, this time for another woman, Francesca, about that job in Switzerland she got through her mother's rich family. Of course, none of that was true, and when Francesca came by Leonarda's house to say goodbye to her, she was offered a glass of poisoned wine, and after she sipped from it, she became dizzy, and then Leonarda showed up with an axe and hacked Francesca to death. But again, when the body parts and the caustic soda were in the pot on the stove boiling together, they were still not coming together the way Leonarda wanted. And so again, Leonarda, with a look of disgust, just dumped the pot down the septic tank and wound up making tea cakes from Francesca's blood. Then the next day, she fed those tea cakes to her friends, as well as Giuseppe, and she also asked Giuseppe to send a few more letters from up north. These letters were, of course, from Francesca. Still feeling totally unsatisfied with how the last two killings had gone, Leonarda moved on to her third target, her best friend, Virginia. And this time, when Virginia came by Leonarda's house to say goodbye, everything went to plan. Leonarda was able to poison Virginia, she killed her with the axe, she chopped her up, she put her in the pot, and this time, the 9 chunks of her body mixed beautifully with the caustic soda. And so after adding a few fine perfumes into the pot, Leonarda was finally able to create the thing that she had not been able to create with the other 2 women's bodies. And that was a beautiful, rich, creamy bar of soap. She also, again, made tea cakes from Virginia's blood. That night, when Giuseppe came home, Leonarda demanded that she be allowed to bathe him with her magic soap, i.e. the soap made from Virginia's body. And so she did that. She scrubbed him with Virginia's body soap. And then while she was doing that, she fed him the tea cakes that were made from Virginia's blood. It would turn out Leonarda did in fact believe that in order to save her son from this curse, she would need to give something beautiful to the universe. And at first, she really had believed that the way to do that was by helping the people of Correggio above and beyond anything she had ever done before. But at some point during her interactions with Faustina, the first woman, Leonarda had decided that, you know what, that wasn't enough. She really needed to make sure that her son was going to be safe. And so the only way really that Leonarda could guarantee her son would be safe would be if she actually took a life and gave that back to the universe. That would save her son. The reason Leonarda wound up taking 3 lives and not just 1 life is because she also decided that as an extra protective measure, she wanted to make sure that she actually bathed her son, literally, in the body parts and kind of essence of the life she had taken. And so that's where the idea of the soap came in. However, the first 2 women, their body parts didn't mix right, and so she couldn't turn them into soap. But then Virginia came along and her body did mix with the caustic soda. And so Leonarda was able to make her soap. She was able to bathe her son with Virginia's body and feed him Virginia's blood. And so in Leonarda's mind, she had done everything she could to protect her son at that point. Leonarda would ultimately be sentenced to 30 years in prison, as well as 3 years in an insane asylum, just as the fortune teller had predicted. Leonarda died in 1970 when she was 76 years old. As for her family, they fled Correggio, and 3 of her children changed their names and vanished. And her prized son, Giuseppe, who she had killed to protect, had gone on to join the military, and he would go to war, and he either was killed in combat or simply changed his name and vanished as well.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of the Ballen Studios podcasts. We have this one, the main show, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and we have Runful. You can find all of these podcasts simply by searching for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the one you heard today that are in video format on our YouTube channel, and that channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Have you ever had the overwhelming feeling that something or someone was watching you? Well, today's podcast features 3 stories that will have you checking your house for intruders before you go to sleep. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Never Alone, and it's about a father who notices writing inside of his daughter's closet. The second story you'll hear is called Awful Routine, and it's about a man who finds something totally unexpected inside of his attic. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Stripes, and it's one of the most popular spooky stories on Reddit. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer the Amazon Music follow button a beer, but give them NO duels. Okay, let's get into our first story called Never Alone. In February of 2013, a young woman named Kim finally moved out of her parents' house, and she moved into this tiny little apartment that she absolutely loved. Kim had severe social anxiety. She could not stand being out in public, talking to people she didn't know, and so she would do everything in her power to stay indoors. She had a job that didn't require her to travel, and so having this little apartment was like her little oasis. When she was there, she was safe. If she had to leave, she was practically running to her car and running back so she didn't have to talk to anybody. In those first few weeks she was living there, as much as she tried to avoid all contact with other people, there was one person she was kind of forced to have an interaction with, and that was her landlord. But her landlord turned out to be this awesome old woman named Olivia, who really took a liking to Kim and kind of looked at Kim as like her daughter, and Kim was surprised at herself for wanting to interact with Olivia. She was very comforting and she was this really nice lady. And so even though they didn't actually interact that much, they developed this relationship where Olivia liked to make food, and she'd come over to Kim's door and she'd knock and she'd leave it outside of her door, and she didn't expect Kim to come out and talk to her. She knew Kim was uncomfortable being out in public, and so she didn't push her to do that. Instead, she just expected her to eat some nice food, and whenever Kim was done eating, to put her dishes back outside the door, and Olivia would take it up and she would go clean it, and that was that. And so Kim really grew to love Olivia and was very happy to have her there. It was like she made her feel safe. 2 months after moving into this tiny little new apartment, Kim started taking a new medication for her anxiety. Now, historically, she had taken a whole bunch of different medications and knew when you start a new one, it's not uncommon to have a whole bunch of side effects that you're just not used to, and they're kind of awful, and you need some time to get used to them. So at the same time she's taking this new medication, she starts to notice that she's forgetting things. Things in her apartment are being put in places she does not remember putting them. And things are going missing and she can't remember where she put them. And so even though she was expecting side effects from this new drug, she was really frustrated with the memory loss. She also noticed this medication made her exceptionally drowsy, to the point where most days she had to take a nap for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day just to get through the day. Because Kim had such intense anxiety about being out in public, she did not want to go to the doctors to get a different prescription or to even talk to the doctor about, is this normal? Because that doctor's visit would necessitate a whole bunch of interactions with people she doesn't want to interact with. And so she decided, you know what, I'm just going to take my medication, I'm going to let myself adjust to this new normal, and everything will be just fine. During the time period that she's experiencing all these side effects that she is attributing to her new medication, she got a delivery from Olivia. It was a Greek salad that she knew Kim loved, and Kim's psyched about this Greek salad. She brings it in her apartment, and she decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have a nice day to myself. I'm going to go in my bedroom. I'm going to turn on Netflix. I'm going to eat this salad in bed. It's going to be awesome. And so she's sitting in bed. She's eating her salad. She's watching Portlandia. and then she falls asleep right in the middle. Like as she's eating her salad, she's falling asleep. She's so tired. When she woke up, she's like, wow, I've never fallen asleep that hard and that fast before. And she's literally still got the fork in her hand from eating her salad. And then she notices on the other side of the bed, the left side of the bed, these sheets are all disturbed, like someone has been laying there. And Kim always sleeps on the right side of the bed. It was almost like a compulsion for Kim that she could never sleep on the left side, like it was bad luck. And she reaches her hand out and she feels that side of the bed where it's been disturbed and it's still warm. And so she quickly thinks to herself, well, I guess I must have rolled over and laid on that side of the bed and then rolled back to this side, just miraculously right back in the same position I was in with the salad fork still in hand. And that's when it kind of clicks in her head, like, that's not possible. That's not possible. So what does that mean? Does that mean someone's in my apartment right now? And so she leaps out of bed, she gets her phone, she enters 911 and she's ready to dial it. And she flips on all the lights in her apartment. She's running around and there's no one in her apartment. The apartment's still locked. Everything is normal. And so she puts her phone away and her heart's still racing. She's very stressed out about what's just occurred. Because in her mind, in the back of her mind anyways, she knows she didn't roll over. That didn't happen. This is when Kim began to wonder, are all these strange happenings in my apartment connected to what just happened now? Because this incident right here does not feel medication side effect driven. And so all of a sudden she's looking at the other weird things in her apartment, like the missing toothbrush and the missing shoes and things getting moved around, as suddenly connected. And it dawns on her that maybe she's been blind to something else happening. Maybe someone is breaking into my apartment. So for the next couple of days, Kim watched her apartment like a hawk to see if there was any indication of somebody breaking into her apartment at any point. And there was nothing. She always locked the door. She always kept the windows shut. The only thing that stood out to her was when she woke up in the mornings, her bedroom had a very distinctive smell to it. It wasn't her smell, and it wasn't a smell she was used to. It was like another person's smell, and it really freaked her out. She decided it's time to tell my parents. And so when she tells her parents and she's describing out loud what's been going on in her apartment, it's the first time she's hearing herself say this stuff out loud. And it sounds way more creepy and way more scary than it did in her own head. And so as she's telling them, she's becoming scared to go back to her apartment. And her dad picks up on that and says, hey, I'll go back with you. We'll look around your apartment and we'll make sure it's safe and secure. And then on the way out, we'll check in with your landlady and we'll let her know what's going on. So she's brought in and everything's going to be fine. They go back to her apartment, they go inside, and when they walk in, everything looks normal. They kind of do a walk through the apartment, looks normal. But before her dad leaves, he says, hey, let me just do a closer inspection of your whole apartment. Let me look everywhere and make sure there's not like some special way to get in here, just to give you peace of mind. And so he went into her bedroom and he starts looking around and he's lifting up the mattress and looking underneath. And then he opens up her closet, which is this big closet, lots of clothes in there. It's not quite a walk-in closet, but it's big enough that you can easily stand in there. And her father reaches in and splits the clothes and he uses his light to look at all of the back wall. And he pushes on it and he taps on it and he sees if there's any sort of special compartment. There's not. But before he walks out again, he notices a little blurb of writing on the bottom right corner of the inner wall, an area that you could only see if you were standing in the closet looking for strange things on the wall of the inside of this closet. He kneels down to take a look at it, and it's this little tiny blurb of text that says, come back here so I can look at you. And the only way you could write it is if you were laying down in this tiny little corner facing the exit of the closet. And that's when her father looks at the bottom of the closet and one of the slats on the closet door was missing. And so in theory, if you were someone that was writing this message, you'd be laying down where your eyes would be looking through that slat right at her bed. Her father put it together and he stood up. He walked out to his daughter and he said, come over here. He showed her what's in her closet and he said, did you write that? And she goes, no. And he goes, all right, it's time to leave. They walk outside, they go to his truck, and he calls the police and he says, someone's breaking into my daughter's apartment. Police show up and using CCTV footage, They capture a grown man regularly going into Kim's apartment in the middle of the night, and he clearly has a key. It would turn out to be Olivia's grown adult son named Henry, who lived with her, who apparently, as soon as he saw Kim for the first time, he fell madly in love with her and became very obsessed with her. And he developed this fake relationship in his mind where he believed he and Kim were dating, even though Kim didn't even know Henry existed. She didn't even know he was living with Olivia. She had never seen him before. During questioning, Henry said what he did is he got sleeping pills and he ground them up, and anytime his mother was delivering food to Kim, which she loved to do, and she was always excited about it, so she was talking about it so he would know it was happening, he would put sleeping pills in her food, he would mix it in, and then he knew as soon as it was delivered, she would be asleep, and he would use his mother's spare key to go into the apartment, and what he said he did is he never touched her. He never laid a hand on Kim. Instead, he laid next to her in bed or watched her from inside the closet. So for the 4 months that Kim lived in this apartment, where she believed every time she came inside and shut the doors that she was kind of away from society, she could just be alone in her bubble, well, in reality, there was some psychopath just a few feet away from her almost the entire time. When Olivia found out about all of this, she made a point to tell Kim she had nothing to do with it and she was terribly sorry, but their friendship ended.
Our next story is called Awful Routine.
In July of 2017, Jerome Kennedy was laying in bed next to his wife, and his 10-month-old daughter was sleeping in her crib in the corner of their bedroom. And as he's laying there, he starts to hear what sounds like scuffling sounds above his ceiling. Now, above his ceiling was an attic. It was more like a crawl space because it was incredibly tight, and Jerome and his family didn't keep anything up there. They didn't spend any time up there, in fact. And so Jerome's laying here thinking, man, did an animal get up there? I mean, this is a pretty old apartment building. It's certainly possible that a squirrel or something could have crawled inside the attic, and that's what's making the sound. But eventually that night, the sound stopped and Jerome went to sleep. The next day, Jerome went up into the crawl space and there was nothing up there. But it's a pretty big space, and again, it's pretty difficult to maneuver around, so he thought, it is still possible that there could be an animal up here. But there wasn't any immediately obvious signs, and so he went back down and just hoped it would stop. A couple days go by and he hasn't heard anything in the attic, and then one night he wakes up to the sounds in the attic. And when he opens his eyes, there's a vent that sits at the top of the wall right in front of him that's actually over his daughter's crib, and he could have sworn he saw what looked like a flashlight coming from the attic. Immediately, he gets up and walks over and pulls the vent cover out, and he's looking into the attic, but it's not a good view. It's a curved vent, so at best, you're getting a little sliver of a view into the crawl space, and he didn't see any more light, and he didn't hear anything else, and so once again, he kind of chalks it up, puts the vent cover back in place, gets back in bed, and falls asleep. The next morning, he tells his wife about the light he saw in the vent. Now, they had already spoken about the strange sounds coming from the attic, and she knew that perhaps there was some animal up there, but the light definitely caught her off guard. But then she remembered that next door, they were doing a whole bunch of renovations on the apartment, and perhaps the partition, there was a break in it, and they could be doing some late night work, and light could have leaked through the break in their partition wall in the attic, and maybe that was causing the flash of light. So Jerome knocks on his neighbor's door and he says, hey, I saw a weird light in my attic, and I'm trying to see if there's a break in our partition wall that perhaps if you guys were working late last night, light could have poured through onto our side. Is that a possibility? And his neighbor said, we were not working late last night, and I've actually been up into our attic, and I've checked that partition wall because we're doing renovations, and I need to make sure this apartment is in good working order because I'm looking to sell it, and that partition wall is solid, so I don't think there's a break in it. Jerome and his wife are totally stumped, and so they decide, let's just put a security camera up in the attic and let's see what's moving around up there. Let's see what's causing the light and these sounds. So that day, Jerome goes out, he gets a little security camera, he comes home, he installs it in his attic, and then he, his wife, and his daughter go to bed. That night, Jerome doesn't wake up to any sounds in the ceiling, he doesn't see any lights, and so when he goes to check the footage the next morning, he's not expecting to see anything, but he is shocked at what he discovers. In the middle of the night, after Jerome, his wife, and his young daughter have already fallen asleep, you see on camera as the partition that separates Jerome's attic from his neighbor's attic slides open, and in crawls who else but Jerome's neighbor, Robert Havrilla, the same guy he was speaking to the day earlier about, hey, have you heard anything in the attic? Well, turned out it was his neighbor. So he comes in, he's carrying a drill and a plank of wood, and he crawls very quietly over Jerome's side of the apartment, and then he pulls aside some insulation that clearly he had already detached before because it slid out of the way very easily. He lays the plank down over some beams and he gets himself positioned over it, and then he uses his drill to drill a hole right into Jerome's ceiling, and it would happen to be directly above his daughter's crib. He'd put the drill back, and then he'd lay there on the plank of wood and stare through the hole at Jerome's daughter for 30 minutes without flinching. After he was satisfied, he got up, pulled the plank out of the way, he slid the insulation back in place, he grabbed his drill and the plank of wood, and he crawled his way back into his side and shut the false door. Jerome calls police, who come over and they look at the footage and they immediately arrest his neighbor. But then when they go up into the attic to look for themselves, they find there's all these different drill holes that have been carefully covered over, because their neighbor had been doing this for some time and had developed a sort of awful routine where he would come in and spy on the family, specifically their infant daughter. Jerome's neighbor was found guilty of criminal trespassing and was given 5 years of probation and had to pay Jerome's family $2,245.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Stripes. On a warm summer night in 1998, a 7-year-old boy named Tyler Florian fell asleep watching TV on his living room couch. Tyler lived with his parents as well as his older brother, Will, who was 10 years old, in a modest 2-story home in a rural neighborhood in West Virginia. That night, Tyler's father, who normally tucked the boys in at night, was out for work. And so after Tyler fell asleep, it was his mother who gently woke him up and encouraged him to head upstairs to his room. And so Tyler, he gets off the couch and he's groggy and he makes his way over to the stairs. He climbs up the stairs and he turns right and heads down the hallway to his room. He goes into his bedroom, he climbs into his bed, and then he falls asleep. In order to understand what happens next, you need to have a good understanding of the layout of the second floor hallway. That hallway stretched from the front of the house all the way to the back of the house. And at either end of this hallway were doors that led outside of the house, and these doors had big windows on them. The front of the house, that door, if you walked out it, you'd be walking out onto a balcony that overlooked the front yard of the property. But if you walked out the back door of this second floor hallway, you would not be walking onto a balcony. You would not even be on the second floor. You'd be basically stepping into the backyard of the house. And the reason for this is because the house was built into a hill. And so the back half of the house is literally underground. It's in the hill. And so there is no door on the lower half of the house because there's just earth behind the door. And so it's that second floor doorway at the end of the hall that serves as kind of like the exit to the backyard of the house. So with that in mind, Tyler, he gets upstairs, he goes to his bedroom, which is towards the front half of this hallway, and he falls asleep. And then only about an hour after falling asleep, he wakes up to the sound of someone using the bathroom. Tyler's bedroom was positioned right across the hall from the bathroom,
and his door was open, and so Tyler's laying on his bed. He opens his eyes, and he's looking through his open door at the bathroom, and the door is shut, but he can see there's light coming out from underneath the bottom of the door, so he knows someone's in there. And so Tyler's just laying there watching whoever's in there. He's assuming it's his brother, who has a habit of going to the bathroom in the middle of the night. And so he's just kind of watching, and then at some point he hears the flick of the light as it's turned off, and he sees the light disappear from inside of the bathroom. The door swings open, and sure enough, it's his brother who steps back into the hallway. His brother looks into Tyler's room, but doesn't attempt to interact with Tyler. Instead, Will just turns and walks back down the hallway towards his bedroom. And so as Tyler is listening to the sound of his brother's footsteps fade down the hallway, he closes his eyes again and prepares to go back to sleep. But as he's laying there with his eyes closed, he can tell that his brother has stopped short of his bedroom and has turned around and is now walking back up the hallway towards the bathroom and towards Tyler's room. And so Tyler opens his eyes again because he knows his brother is about to be right in front of his bedroom, and he's thinking, okay, maybe he forgot something in the bathroom, and so Tyler decides to just watch to see what his brother does. And so sure enough, Will walks all the way up until he's standing right in front of Tyler's open door, but instead of going into the bathroom, Will walks into Tyler's room. And right away, Tyler sits up and says, hey, what are you doing? What's going on? And his brother, he pauses for a second, and he begins to say something that sounds like he saw something out there, but, he's hesitant. He doesn't really know how he wants to frame the thing he wants to say. And so Tyler's like, come on, what are you doing? It's the middle of the night. What's going on? And finally, Will just blurts out, I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. And so Tyler, he hears this and he can't compute what he's being told. And so he just says, what? What are you talking about, Will? What did you see in the hallway? And Will would say again, I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. I've seen him a couple times in the last couple of days. I go to the bathroom, and then when I start walking back, I see him outside the back door in our backyard. And so Tyler is so scared because his brother does not sound like he's making a joke. His brother sounds like he's telling the truth. And just the fact that his brother can't quite find the words to describe what he saw made it seem even more real. And so Tyler, he gets out of bed and he says, Will, we gotta go tell Mom. But that required going into the hallway and going down the hall towards where apparently this man in stripes was to get to their mother's bedroom. And so Will, who initially was not that scared of this man in stripes he had seen, was now starting to get pretty panicked in seeing Tyler's reaction to this. And so Will tells Tyler, stay right there, stay in the room. And so Will, he kind of peeks back into the hallway and he looks all the way down and there is no man in stripes anymore. There's no one in the hall. And so he tells Tyler, the coast is clear. And the two of them run down the hallway all the way right in front of that door that leads into the back of the property where the man in stripes was. And they turn left and they go into their parents' bedroom where just their mother was because their father was out of town. And so they charge in there, they wake their mom up and they're talking over each other, trying to communicate to their mom that there was a ghost, that there was an intruder, that there was something bad happening around their house. And so finally their mom just tells them to be quiet and she says, okay, boys, sit on the bed. I'm going to go have a look around the house. And so the two boys do as they're told. They sit on the bed. And their mom leaves the bedroom, she goes into the hallway, and she looks immediately to her left, where the man in stripes supposedly was, and she doesn't see anything. She just looks out into their backyard, there's nothing there. She looks down the other direction, out the front of the house, doesn't see anything. She walks all around the house, she goes outside, she looks everywhere, but she doesn't see anyone or anything. And so eventually, she comes back inside the house, she goes up to the second floor, she goes back to her bedroom, and she tells her boys, look, you probably just spooked yourselves. There is no man in stripes. You're totally safe. You're totally fine. Just go back to bed. You probably just imagined whatever you saw. And so Will, who was the one who saw the man in stripes, was very quick to accept his mother's answer. It actually seemed like it was a relief to have somebody tell him that what you had seen wasn't real. And so he very happily went back to his bed and he fell asleep. But Tyler, who had not seen the man in stripes, but had a very intense reaction to hearing his brother describe it, could not accept his mother's answer. It just totally freaked him out. because his brother was always joking around about stuff, but this did not feel like a joke. This felt very, very real. But over the course of the next couple of days, weeks, months, years, Will never claimed to see the man in stripes again, and so pretty quickly, Tyler forgot about it. Fast forward 11 years to 2009, so Tyler is now 18 years old, and he and his mom were out in the car running some errands. And as they're driving around, they were just chatting about all sorts of different things, and at some point, they began talking about one of their beloved family pets, a dog named Max that they had when Tyler was really young. And so as they're kind of swapping stories about all the goofy things that this dog did, Tyler's mom suddenly says, "Hey, Tyler, do you remember the time that I opened the front door to let the cops into the house and Max came bounding into the house and he went right into the kitchen and he ripped open all the food?" And Tyler's looking at his mom like, "Wait, when did the cops come to our house? When did you open the door to let the cops come into our house?" And as soon as Tyler said this to his mom looked at him as if she had just given away something she hadn't meant to, and then she kind of relaxed and said, "You know what? I never got around to telling you. Now that I'm thinking about it, you and your brother were asleep and you didn't even know this happened. And then afterward, me and your father decided not to tell you guys because we didn't want to scare you." Back when you were about 7 years old and Will was about 10 years old, your dad was away at work and we were all asleep one night when suddenly I wake up to the sound of someone or something moving around outside of our house. And so I sit up in bed and I go into the hallway and I look left and I look out that door into our backyard and I see standing up against the glass this man with his hands pressed to the window looking into the house. And so Tyler's mom would tell him how she totally freaked out and she flipped on the lights and it scared this guy who ran off. And then she called the police and then the police showed up and that's when their dog Max came bounding inside and shredded the bag of food. And the police, they searched the property, but apparently they never found this guy. Tyler's mom would go on to tell him that the police warned her that her description of this man that was standing at their back door matched the description of a man who was wanted for murder who was on the loose in the area. Tyler was dumbfounded. He didn't remember this because obviously he had been asleep because this is something he would have remembered. And so he had so many questions about this whole situation. But the first question he asked his mom was, well, what did he look like? And his mom said, well, he was tall, he had dark hair, he had blue jeans on, and oh, you know what? He had a striped shirt on. It would turn out for a couple of days in the summer of 1998, this suspected murderer who was on the run from police had apparently been hiding out on Tyler's family's property, and in the middle of the night, for whatever reason, this suspected murderer would walk over to the back door of the second floor hallway and he would put his face up to the glass and he would stare into their home. This was the man in stripes that Will claimed to have seen. He was real. Tyler, after making this connection, would follow up with his family members and he would do some digging of his own, but he was never able to figure out who the man in stripes was or what happened to him.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our other studios podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.